The auctioneer's voice cut through the autumn air like a whip crack. Well now, gentlemen, what we have here is a situation. Laughter rippled through the crowd before Clara Whitmore had even set her second foot on the platform. She heard it, every note of it. The man with the gavel, red-faced, self-satisfied, the kind of man who had never missed a meal in his life, looked her up and down with the slow, deliberate cruelty of someone who knew the crowd was watching and wanted to give them a show. I'm going to be honest with you folks, he said, loud enough for the whole square to hear. The agency sent us some fine young women this season, accomplished ladies, pretty ladies. He paused, letting the silence stretch. And then they sent us her. The laughter hit harder this time. Clara stood on the wooden platform in the October wind, holding her suitcase with both hands, and she did not look down. That was the only decision she had control over in that moment, where she pointed her eyes. And she chose straight ahead. If you are watching this story and you have ever been judged before anyone knew your name, stay with me, because what happens next changes everything. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel so you never miss the stories that matter. Hit that like button and drop a comment below telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to that platform, because the moment that auctioneer opened his mouth was not the end of Clara Whitmore's story. It was the beginning. The town of Harlan Creek, Montana, was not a forgiving place. It had been carved out of rock and stubbornness by men who came west with nothing but a mule and a temper, and the years had not softened it. The streets were dirt. The buildings were raw timber. The wind came off the mountains like it had a grudge, and by November it could kill a man who wasn't paying attention. But in October of 1885, on a bright and merciless afternoon, the main square was full of people in their good clothes, because a new round of mail-order brides had arrived on the stage from Billings, and in Harlan Creek, that was as close to entertainment as most folks got. 6 women had stepped off that stage. 5 of them were already spoken for. Clara Whitmore was the 6th. She was 29 years old, which was already a mark against her in a room full of men who thought a woman's value dropped by half after 25. She was not small. Life had never given her the luxury of being small. Not in body, not in burden. She had worked since she was 11 years old, first in her stepfather's kitchen, then in a textile mill that took 3 fingers from the woman who worked the machine next to her, then in a boarding house where she cooked for 14 men and slept in a closet off the kitchen. She had saved every spare cent for 2 years to afford the agency fee. She had written her own letter to the agency by candlelight, 3 drafts, because she wanted to get the words right. Not to deceive anyone, but because she believed that if she could just explain herself clearly, someone would see her for what she actually was. The agency had sent her to Harlan Creek, and now here she stood, on a platform in front of strangers, while a man with a gavel described her like she was a lame horse at auction. Now, I don't want to be unkind, the auctioneer said, in the tone of a man who very much did want to be unkind. But a rancher's got to think practical. You take on a bride, you're taking on a partner, someone who can keep up. He looked at Clara again and shook his head, as though personally saddened by the situation. I'm just saying, a man's got choices. A few of the men in the front row murmured to each other. Some of them weren't even looking at her anymore. Clara's grip tightened on the suitcase handle. She had rehearsed a version of this moment in her head during the 3-day stage ride. She had told herself she would be dignified. She had told herself she would not react. She had told herself that what strangers thought of her at first glance was simply not her business. What she had not rehearsed was the sound of children laughing. There were 2 boys, maybe 10 and 12, standing near the front of the crowd, and one of them said something to the other behind his hand, and they both broke into giggles. And the sound of it, high and careless and without any malice, just the pure thoughtless cruelty of children who haven't been taught better, landed somewhere behind Clara's sternum and did not move. She breathed through it. What can you offer a hard-working ranch family? The auctioneer asked her directly, spreading his hands like he was giving her a chance. The square went quiet. Clara had not planned to speak. She had planned to wait, to let whatever was going to happen happen, to survive the next 10 minutes the same way she had survived every other humiliation, quietly, internally, with her face arranged into something neutral, but the words came out anyway. I can cook for 20 people without wasting a pound of flour, she said. Her voice was steady, which surprised her. I can preserve enough food to get a household through a Montana winter. I can manage accounts, mend equipment, negotiate with suppliers, and I have never once walked away from something I built because it got hard. Silence. That's what I offer. The auctioneer blinked. Then he recovered, turning back to the crowd with a smile that said, "Well, isn't that sweet?" And the moment passed, and the men went back to not looking at her. And Clara stood there with her suitcase and her steady voice, and the sound of those children laughing still lodged somewhere it shouldn't be. One by one, the other women were approached by men with hats in their hands and practiced introductions. Clara watched it happen. She watched a woman named Agnes, who was 17 and terrified, get claimed by a cattle farmer who looked kind enough. She watched a widow named Ruth accept the arm of a man twice her age who had the decent grace to seem nervous. She watched the square slowly empty of everyone except herself, the auctioneer, and a woman from the agency who was pretending to review her paperwork. No one approached Clara, not one man. The auctioneer eventually stopped performing and just stood there looking at the ground, which was almost worse than the mockery, because at least mockery acknowledged her existence. Clara set her suitcase down. Her arms ached. She was calculating, quietly, what happened next. She had enough money for 2 nights at the boarding house if they had a room. After that, she would need work. And in a town this size, work meant laundry or cooking for someone else's household. And she could do that. She had done that her whole life. It would just mean that the 2 years of saving and the 3-day stage ride and the letter she had written by candlelight had amounted to nothing. She was working through that possibility, trying to make peace with it, when a voice came from the back of the square. "I'll take her." The words were not loud. They were not performed. They landed in the square with a kind of flat certainty that made people turn around the way they turned around when something unexpected fell. Not because of the sound, but because of the weight. The man walking forward was not in a hurry. He was tall, not in an obvious front-of-the-room way, but in the way of someone who had spent years outdoors and simply occupied space naturally. His coat was good quality, but not new. His hat was pushed back slightly, which gave him the look of someone who had just come from work and hadn't thought to adjust it. He had dark eyes and a face that had been weathered enough to make his age difficult to read, somewhere between 40 and whatever life had added on top of that. Clara recognized the reaction in the crowd before she understood the reason for it. People moved, not away from him, toward him, slightly, that unconscious lean that happens when someone important enters a room. The auctioneer straightened up. The agency woman stopped pretending to read her paperwork. "Mr. Blackwood," the auctioneer said. The performance was gone from his voice now. "We weren't expecting. I know you weren't. Ethan Blackwood stopped at the base of the platform. He looked up at Clara, and his expression was not kind, and it was not unkind. It was simply attentive, in the way of a man accustomed to evaluating things accurately. "You're Clara Whitmore?" "I am." "You said you can manage accounts." "Yes." "My last housekeeper couldn't read. The one before her could read but couldn't add past 100. I've got 12 ranch hands, 4 children, and a supply operation that loses money every quarter because nobody's keeping proper track of it." He said all of this without warmth or apology, the way a man states the terms of a transaction. "Is that something you can handle?" Clara looked at him steadily. She was aware of the crowd watching. She was aware of the auctioneer gaping. She was aware that something was happening here that she did not fully understand because a man like this, a man the entire town clearly deferred to without being asked, did not need to come to a public bride auction. He had not come here looking for a wife. He had not come here at all, she suspected, until something had made him stop and turn around. "Yes," she said, "that's something I can handle." Ethan Blackwood looked at her for another moment, then gave a single nod, as if confirming something he'd already decided. "Then let's get the paperwork done." He walked to the agency table. Clara picked up her suitcase. Behind her, she could hear the crowd beginning to talk again. Fast, low, the way people talk when they've just witnessed something they need to process. She caught fragments. Why her? Of all the women, after everything with his wife, what's he thinking? She did not turn around. She would not turn around. But her heart was doing something unsteady and complicated that she had no name for yet, something that was not happiness exactly, and not fear exactly, but lived in the territory between those two things, in the place where a person stands when the door they thought was closing is suddenly still open. Mom. The Blackwood Ranch was 12 miles outside of Harlan Creek, and the ride out there told Clara everything the town itself had not. Ethan drove. He did not make conversation, which Clara did not take personally. She was not a woman who mistook silence for hostility. Some people were quiet. She had worked for quiet people before. Quiet was manageable. What she paid attention to instead was the land. It was enormous. That was the first thing. The kind of enormous that took a moment to fully register, because the eye kept expecting a boundary that never came. The grassland stretched in every direction, broken by ridgelines that were already dusted with early snow, and the sky above it had the particular quality of late afternoon light in high country, long and golden and slightly melancholy, like the day was trying to hold on. The cattle operation was visible before the house was. Hundreds of animals spread across the lower pastures, tended by figures on horseback who were too far away to read as individual people. Clara counted the structures she could see. The main barn, two smaller outbuildings, a long, low building that was probably the bunkhouse, a water tower. Then the house came into view. It was large. It had been beautiful once. She could see that. 2 stories, a long covered porch, windows that would have caught the morning light if anyone had cleaned them recently. But no one had. The porch railing was broken on the left side. The kitchen garden was winter dead and unpruned, which meant it hadn't been properly put to bed for the season, which meant whatever was left in the soil was already lost. A pile of equipment had been left against the side of the house in a way that suggested it had been left there temporarily a long time ago and simply never moved. The house had the specific, unmistakable look of a place that was being maintained but not cared for. There was a difference. Clara knew it well. Ethan stopped the wagon in front of the house, and before he had even set the brake, the front door opened and 4 children came out. Or, not came out. That implied willingness. They appeared. They stood on the porch in a line and looked at her, and Clara looked back at them, and the silence that followed had nothing in common with the comfortable silence of the wagon ride. The oldest was a boy of about 16, tall and lean, with his father's eyes and an expression that Clara had seen before on children who had taken on too much too young, a kind of premature steadiness that looked like confidence from a distance and felt up close like somebody bracing. Next to him was a girl of perhaps 13 who was doing something complicated with her face, trying to look neutral and not quite managing it, because underneath the neutrality was something raw and defensive. Then a boy of maybe 9, who was simply staring at Clara with the unguarded curiosity of a child who hadn't yet learned to hide it. And then, partly hidden behind the older boy's arm, a girl who looked to be about 5 or 6, with dark curls and very serious eyes. Ethan got down from the wagon without ceremony. "This is Clara Whitmore," he said. "She'll be keeping the house." No further explanation, no softening. He said it the way he'd have told them the supply wagon had arrived. Clara got down from the wagon herself, because it was clear no one was going to help her with it, and picked up her suitcase. "Hello," she said to all 4 of them. The 9-year-old said hello back immediately, with a kind of reflexive politeness that suggested someone had drilled it into him. The other 3 said nothing. The oldest, Caleb, she would learn, looked at her for a long moment with those steady, carefully held eyes, and then he said, in a voice that had not quite finished deciding what it wanted to be, "We had a housekeeper last year, and one the year before." "I know," Clara said. He looked at her. "No, you don't." "You're right," she said. "I don't know what happened with them specifically, but I can see what the house looks like, and I can see what you all look like, and I have a general idea." Something shifted in his expression. Not softened. That wasn't the right word. More like registered. "You won't last here," he said. He said it without cruelty. He said it the way someone states a fact they've learned from experience, the way you tell a newcomer that the creek floods in spring, not to be unkind, but because it's true and they should know it. Clara looked at him. "You might be right," she said. He hadn't expected that. His face showed it briefly before he put the steadiness back on. "But I'm going to try," she added. "And I don't try things halfway." The little girl with the dark curls leaned out from behind her brother's arm and looked at Clara with those serious eyes, and Clara looked back at her, and something passed between them that was too small and too quick to name. Just a moment of mutual attention, the kind that sometimes means nothing and sometimes means everything. Ethan was already walking toward the barn. "Mrs. Aldridge will show you to your room," he said over his shoulder, referring, apparently, to someone inside. Supper at 6. And that was that. Clara stood in front of the Blackwood house with her suitcase and her worn dress and the Montana wind pulling at her hair, and she looked at the broken porch railing and the dead garden and the 4 children watching her from the steps, and she thought, all right, here we go. Not with hope, exactly. She was 30 years old, almost, and hope was a thing she rationed carefully. But with something. Some banked, stubborn, very particular thing that had gotten her through the mill and the boarding house and the platform in the town square, that had written 3 drafts of a letter by candlelight and saved money for 2 years and ridden 3 days on a stage and stood in front of a crowd that was laughing. She didn't have a word for it. She just picked up her suitcase and walked up the steps. Quote. The first week was an education. Mrs. Aldridge, who turned out to be a heavy-set woman in her 60s, with a gimpy knee and a way of watching Clara that was not quite hostile, but was definitely evaluating, showed her the house on that first evening with the efficiency of someone who had done this before and expected to do it again. The kitchen was the best room. Someone had cared about the kitchen once. The cast-iron stove was a good one, properly seasoned, and there were solid shelves and adequate workspace. The pantry, however, was a disaster. Poorly organized, badly stocked, with 3 separate bags of salt and almost no preserved vegetables, because whoever had been managing supplies had not been thinking past the immediate week. The ledger books were in Ethan's office, and when Clara asked to see them, politely, carefully, aware that she was on uncertain ground, Ethan looked at her for a moment and then pushed them across the desk without comment. She spent 2 hours with those books. By the end of those 2 hours, she understood why the supply operation was losing money. It wasn't complicated. It was simply that no one had been watching the smaller numbers, the incidental purchases, the small recurring costs that individually meant nothing and collectively meant hundreds of dollars a year. It was the kind of thing that happened when everyone was too busy surviving to step back and look at the whole picture. She wrote out a summary on a clean sheet of paper and left it on his desk. She did not tell him about it. She did not ask for credit. She just left it there and went back to the kitchen. She found out later that he read it twice. The children were a separate project entirely. The 9-year-old, whose name was Henry, took to her the fastest, partly because he was young enough to still be open to things, and partly because Clara had learned early that the fastest way to a child's trust was to be genuinely interested in whatever they were interested in, and Henry was interested in approximately everything. He had a collection of rocks that he kept under his bed, organized by some system of classification that was entirely his own and only partially geological. Within 3 days, he was explaining it to her while she mended socks at the kitchen table, and she listened properly, asked real questions, and remembered what he told her. The little girl, whose name was Rose, watched this from the doorway for 2 days before she came closer. She didn't speak to Clara directly for the first 4 days. She just appeared nearby. In the kitchen when Clara was cooking, on the porch when Clara was checking the weather, at the edge of the yard when Clara was assessing what was left in the kitchen garden. Just present, watching. On the 5th day, Rose came and stood next to Clara while she was kneading bread dough, and without asking permission or saying anything, she climbed up on the stool next to the work table and held out her hands. Clara looked at her. Rose looked at the dough. Clara put a portion of it in front of her without comment. They kneaded in silence for a while. It was not a resolution. It was not a breakthrough. It was just a small thing. A child who had been watching long enough to decide she wanted to be near someone, and the someone in question having enough sense not to make a big deal out of it. Caleb remained a wall. Not hostile, exactly. Clara revised that impression as the days went on. He was not cruel. He did his work. He was respectful, in a minimal technical sense, the way someone is respectful when they've been told to be. But he watched her with those steady eyes every time she made a decision about the house, every time she spoke to his younger siblings, every time she sat at the kitchen table in the evening and worked on the accounts, as though he was waiting for something. She wasn't sure what. She wasn't sure he knew either. The 13-year-old, whose name was May, was the most difficult to read. She helped in the house without being asked, which should have been a good sign but wasn't. It had the feeling of policing rather than participation, as if she was watching to make sure Clara didn't break anything or move anything or change anything that couldn't be changed back. On the 8th day, Clara moved the furniture in the front room. Not dramatically. The settee had been positioned facing the wall, which made no sense for actual use, and there was a reading chair by the window that was so far from the lamp it was useless for reading. She spent an hour rearranging it into something that worked for the people who actually lived there. She came back from the kitchen an hour later to find May moving the settee back. Clara stood in the doorway and watched her. May was not looking at her. She was looking at the floor, at the legs of the settee, her jaw set. "It was my mother's," May said, to the floor. "Where she put it." A beat of silence. Clara walked into the room, and without arguing, without explaining, she helped May move the settee back to where it had been. They didn't talk about it, but May didn't leave the room immediately when they finished. She stood there for a moment holding the arm of the settee, and Clara said, "Will you show me where everything else was? Before." May looked at her. Something moved in her face that was fast and complicated. "It'll take a while," May said finally. "I've got time," Clara said. And that was the beginning of something that was not yet friendship and not yet trust, but was the thing that comes before both of those. The recognition that the other person is actually paying attention. It was on the 9th evening that Victoria Ashford came to call. Clara had been told about Victoria in the way that small towns convey information, not directly, but through the careful density of what isn't said. From Mrs. Aldridge's brief dismissive reference to the Ashford woman. From the way Henry had described the neighboring ranch with a child's uncensored accuracy. "They have more cattle than us now. Papa doesn't like to talk about it." Victoria arrived in a carriage that was better than it needed to be for a ranch visit, with a driver and a basket of food that was clearly meant to look neighborly and functioned instead as a declaration. She was everything Clara was not, and she knew it, and she used it the way some people use a well-chosen weapon, precisely and with plausible deniability. She was perhaps 35, slender and composed in the particular way of women who have never had to worry about where the next meal was coming from. She came into the Blackwood house with the ease of someone who had come in before, who knew where to sit, who understood the architecture of the place in ways that a newcomer didn't. Clara received her in the front room. Victoria's eyes registered the settee in its original position, and something moved in them that might have been approval, and offered tea, which she had already prepared because Mrs. Aldridge had told her the basket on the porch meant company, and Clara believed in being ready. Victoria took the tea, smiled at Clara with great warmth, and then said, "You must be overwhelmed coming into a household like this. All of this responsibility, 4 children, a ranch this size." "I'm settling in," Clara said. "Of course you are." Said with such sweetness that the patronizing weight of it was almost invisible. Almost. "It's just, and I say this as someone who cares about these children, it's a great deal to ask of someone who hasn't had to manage something like this before." "I've managed quite a lot," Clara said, and she kept her voice mild because she was new here and she understood the calculus. Victoria looked at her steadily, still smiling. "I'm sure you have," she said. "In your circumstances, I imagine you've had to be very resourceful." A pause. "We all do what we can with what we have." It was so perfectly constructed that Clara almost admired it. The sympathy, the implied condescension, the reminder of the gap between their circumstances, all delivered with such genuine-seeming warmth that objecting to any of it would have made Clara look unreasonable. Clara looked at Victoria Ashford across the tea service in Ethan Blackwood's front parlor, and she made a decision. Not today. Not yet. She was 9 days into this household, and she was still finding her footing, and she was not going to burn anything down out of pride. But she held it. She filed it away. The smile, the tone, the careful architecture of the words, in the same internal drawer where she kept the auctioneer's performance on the platform, and the sound of those children laughing, and every other moment in her life when someone had looked at her and seen something disposable. She was building a record. She didn't know yet what she was going to do with it, but she kept it. "Thank you for coming," Clara said, and filled Victoria's cup again, and smiled back, and the afternoon passed. When Victoria's carriage finally pulled away, Clara stood on the porch for a moment in the cold air, and then she went back inside and started on the supper accounts, and she did not say anything about it to anyone. Some things were best worked on quietly. She had always known that. She just hadn't always had anywhere to work. The supper accounts became a ritual. Every evening after the dishes were cleared and the children had gone to their rooms, Clara sat at the kitchen table with the ledger books and a cup of tea that went cold before she ever finished it, and she worked. Not frantically, not with any performance of industry, just steadily, the way water moves. Not dramatic, not loud, but covering ground. It took her 11 days to fully map the problem. The ranch's supply operation was hemorrhaging money in ways that would have been invisible to someone who didn't know what to look for. And the reason it had gone unnoticed for so long was that the losses were distributed, scattered across dozens of small transactions, none of them large enough on their own to raise an alarm. A supplier in Billings who had been overcharging on grain shipments for at least 2 years. A recurring order for salt pork that was being duplicated every third month because whoever placed the orders wasn't checking what was already in storage. Hay bales purchased in summer at full price when the same quantity could have been contracted in spring for 30% less. None of this was fraud. It was just drift, the slow financial decay that happens when a household is being run by people who are competent at their specific jobs but have nobody looking at the whole picture. Clara looked at the whole picture. On the 12th day, she left a second summary on Ethan's desk. This one was longer, 4 pages, organized by category, with specific recommendations and estimated annual savings if the recommendations were followed. She still didn't mention it to him. She went back to the kitchen and started on the bread. That evening, Ethan came to the kitchen doorway and stood there without knocking. Not rudely, just with the carelessness of a man in his own house who hadn't yet recalibrated his habits to account for another person's presence. "You know, Caleb thinks you're keeping these books to build a case," he said. Clara kept her hands in the dough. "A case for what?" "Don't know. He doesn't either. He just doesn't trust accounts being kept by someone he didn't choose to have here." She looked up at him then. He was leaning against the doorframe with his arms folded, and his expression had that same quality she'd noticed on the platform. Attentive, assessing, not particularly warm, but not performing coldness either. Just a man trying to read a situation accurately. "Caleb's not wrong to be cautious," Clara said. "He doesn't know me." "Neither do I," Ethan said. "No," she agreed, "but you read the summaries." A pause. Something moved in his face. Not quite a smile, but in the neighborhood. "Twice," he said. He pushed off the doorframe and walked back toward his office, and Clara returned to her bread. And that was the most direct conversation they'd had in 12 days, and somehow it felt like more ground covered than a week of formal dinners would have managed. The bread came out well that night. It usually did when she was thinking about something else. The cold arrived properly in the 3rd week of October, and with it came the full weight of what a Montana winter meant for a household this size. Clara had known winters. She had grown up in Minnesota, which was not gentle about the season, and she had spent 3 years in a boarding house that had a furnace that worked approximately half the time. But there was a difference between enduring a winter and managing one for a family of 6, plus 12 ranch hands who needed to be fed twice a day, was a project that required thinking 3 months ahead. She started with the pantry. Mrs. Aldridge watched her reorganize it with the expression of a woman who had opinions she was choosing not to voice. "The housekeeper before me," Clara said, not looking up from the shelf she was building an inventory of. "How long was she here?" 4 months, Mrs. Aldridge said. "And the one before that?" 6 weeks. Clara noted this without comment. "What happened to them?" Mrs. Aldridge was quiet long enough that Clara looked up. "The first one left because of the children," the older woman said finally. "The second one, that was Caleb mostly. He's not a bad boy. He just decided she was temporary, so he treated her like it. And eventually she was." Clara nodded. She went back to the inventory. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. "That's what the last one said," Mrs. Aldridge told her, without cruelty. Just as information. "I know," Clara said. "But she didn't have anywhere specific to stay if she left. I don't either. So we'll see who's right." Mrs. Aldridge looked at her for a moment, then made a sound that was not quite a laugh, and was not quite approval, but lived somewhere between the two, and went back to her work. The kitchen garden was the next project. Most of it was already a loss for this season. The frost had come fast, and whatever hadn't been harvested in time was gone. But Clara walked the beds anyway, on a cold morning when the ground was still soft enough to turn, because what you did with a garden in October determined what you had in May, and she was thinking in those terms now. Henry followed her. He had appointed himself her unofficial shadow somewhere around the end of the first week, in the particular way of 9-year-olds who have decided they like someone and have no self-consciousness about showing it. He walked beside her between the beds with his hands in his pockets and offered information about the garden with the authority of someone who had been observing it for years but had never been asked. "Mama planted the beans in that corner," he said, pointing. "Papa kept saying it was too much shade, but they came out good anyway." "Your mother knew what she was doing," Claire said. "She knew everything about the garden," Henry said. This was stated as simple fact, without particular sadness, in the way that children sometimes speak of the dead, directly, without the self-protective distance adults put around loss. She knew about the kitchen too, and horses, and she could fix the harness when it broke, which Papa can't. What was her name? Eleanor. He said it naturally. People called her Ellie sometimes, but she didn't like it. She said Ellie sounded like a horse's name. Clara smiled at the ground. "Do you miss her?" she asked. It was a direct question and she knew it, but she had found that Henry was a child who responded better to directness than to careful navigation around the edges. "Yes," he said, without hesitation. Then, after a beat, "But it's been 2 years. Papa says time is supposed to help. I think he says that because he doesn't know what else to say." Clara stopped walking. Henry stopped beside her, hands still in his pockets, looking out at the dead garden. "Your papa might be right about time," she said, "but I don't think he's wrong about not knowing what to say either. Sometimes there isn't anything to say. Sometimes you just keep going, and eventually the weight of it gets a little easier to carry." She paused. Not gone, just easier. Henry considered this with the seriousness he brought to most things. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, with the careful formality that Mrs. Aldridge had apparently taught him. "Are you going to stay?" She looked at him. His face was open and earnest and very young, and she thought about what Mrs. Aldridge had told her, and she thought about Caleb's assessment delivered from the porch steps on her first day, and she understood that this was not a casual question. "Yes," she said. "You can't know that," he said. "Caleb says you can't know that." "Caleb's right that I can't know everything that's going to happen," she agreed. "But I can know what I intend, and I intend to stay." Henry thought about this, then he nodded, in the manner of someone filing a piece of information into the correct drawer. "Okay," he said, and then abruptly, "The rhubarb needs to be divided before the ground freezes or it'll stop producing. Mama always did it in October." "Show me," Clara said, and they went back to work. Rose had taken to sleeping near Clara's room, not in it. That was too much, and Clara understood without being told that the gesture had to come from Rose in her own time and at her own pace. But the little girl's bedroom was 2 doors down from Clara's, and sometime in the 3rd week Clara noticed that the door was being left open, and that Rose was developing a habit of being awake when Clara came up to bed, and that she would wait until she heard Clara's footsteps on the landing and then, quietly, go to sleep. Clara began saying goodnight outside Rose's door every evening. Nothing elaborate, just, "Good night, Rose." Steady, the same words, the same hour, the way you establish any routine, through repetition that eventually becomes something a person can rely on. On the 4th night of this, a small voice came back through the open door. "Good night, Mrs. Whitmore." Clara stood in the hallway and felt something happen in her chest that she didn't examine too closely, because she was practical enough to know that attachment was a complicated thing in a household like this, and she was not here to replace anyone, and it was too soon to feel certain about anything. But she noted it, in the same internal ledger where she kept everything that mattered. May was a longer project. She was 13, which was, in some ways, the hardest age, old enough to understand what had been lost and why, young enough that the grief of it still had rough edges that caught on everything. She helped in the house with consistent, quiet competence that Clara suspected was her mother's training, showing up where she was needed without being asked, doing the work correctly, saying almost nothing. Clara didn't push. She had understood something about May in the moment with the settee. That this was a girl who was protecting something, and that the worst thing Clara could do was make her feel like that something was under attack. So she worked beside her, and she let May set the pace, and she paid attention without making the attention obvious. What she noticed over those weeks was this. May was watching her the way Clara had once watched a mill supervisor who turned out against all expectation to be fair. With the careful, skeptical attention of someone who expects to be disappointed and is not yet ready to be proven wrong. The moment that changed things between them was small and accidental. It was a Saturday, late in October, and Clara was working on the winter supply contracts, writing to the grain supplier in Billings to renegotiate the pricing, a letter she'd been drafting carefully because the tone had to be firm without being antagonistic. She was at the kitchen table, and May was at the other end of it mending one of Henry's shirts, and they'd been sitting in silence for perhaps half an hour. Clara put down her pen and said, mostly to herself, "I can't figure out how to say this without sounding like I'm accusing someone of something." May looked up. Clara pushed the letter across the table without thinking about it. "Does this read as aggressive?" May looked at the letter. She read it slowly, in the way of someone who reads carefully and doesn't rush. Her expression didn't change much while she was reading, but when she finished, she looked up with something different in her eyes. Not warm, not yet, but engaged. Present. "The third paragraph," May said. "You said your pricing is inconsistent with the market rate. That sounds like you're calling him a liar." "He is one," Clara said. "I know," May said. "But you don't want him to know you know yet. You want him to think you just noticed by accident." A pause. "Say, we've been reviewing our supply costs and find ourselves uncertain about some of the figures. Makes it sound like your mistake. He'll want to fix it to look good." Clara looked at her. May looked back, and there was a flash of something. Awareness that she'd said more than she'd intended, offered more than she'd meant to, lowered something she'd been keeping up. "That's very good," Clara said, and she meant it plainly, without performance. May looked back at the shirt in her hands. "Mama used to say," she said, to the mending, "that the way to win an argument isn't to be louder. It's to make the other person think they already agree with you." "Your mama was smart," Clara said. "She was smarter than most people knew," May said, still to the mending, still not looking up. People saw what she looked like and thought that was the whole thing. A beat of quiet. "That happens to women a lot," Clara said carefully. "It happened to you," May said, "in the square." Clara had not known that May had been there. She had not known any of the children were there. "Were you watching?" she asked. May's jaw tightened slightly. "Henry wanted to see the brides come in. I went with him because he's not supposed to go to town alone." She was quiet for a moment. "I heard what the auctioneer said." Clara was quiet too. "What did you think?" she asked finally. She was not sure why she asked it. She was not sure she wanted to know. May put down the mending. "I thought," she said slowly, "that you were going to cry. And you didn't." A pause. "And then Papa walked up, and I thought, he never does anything without a reason. So there had to be a reason." She looked at Clara directly for the first time in the conversation. "I'm still figuring out what it is." Clara looked back at her. "So am I," she said honestly. And that was the most truthful thing either of them had said to the other, and it left them both a little quieter and a little more comfortable with the quiet than they'd been before. The supply letter went out the following Monday with May's revision in the third paragraph. The Billings supplier wrote back 2 weeks later with a corrected pricing schedule that represented a reduction of nearly $40 per quarter. Clara showed the response to May without comment. May read it and said nothing. But she sat down at the kitchen table that evening and helped Clara with the response, and she did it again the following week, and somewhere in there a habit formed that neither of them named. It was Ethan who complicated everything, not on purpose. He was not a man who complicated things on purpose. Clara had established that early. He was a man who was direct to the point of occasional bluntness, who said what he meant and expected the same in return, and who had so thoroughly organized his life around the practical demands of running a cattle operation that the interior dimensions of his household had simply fallen behind. But he was also, Clara gradually understood, paying attention. She would find things adjusted in the house that she hadn't asked anyone to adjust. The broken railing on the porch repaired one morning, a lamp moved to a more useful position, the woodbox in the kitchen refilled without any conversation about it. Small things, the kind of thing a person does when they've noticed what someone else needs but they're not ready to make anything of it. She did not mention these things to him. He did not mention them to her. But she noticed, and she suspected he knew she noticed, and this was not what she'd expected, not part of the arrangement she'd understood herself to be entering. She had come here as a housekeeper with a legal contract and the title of wife on paper. She had expected, at best, a working partnership in the functional sense, 2 adults managing a household and a business with mutual professionalism and limited personal involvement. She had not expected to find herself thinking, on quiet evenings, that there was more going on behind Ethan Blackwood's measured silences than he let out. The afternoon this became undeniable was in early November. She was in the main barn, not the large cattle barn, but the smaller one where they kept the horses, doing an inventory of the winter feed situation, which was also worse than it should have been and required some creative renegotiation with a local hay farmer. She was partway through counting bales when she heard Ethan come in, and then she heard him stop. She looked around the partition. He was standing just inside the door, and he had not seen her, and he was doing something she had not seen him do in the 5 weeks she'd been there. He was simply standing still, not thinking through a problem, not going somewhere, just stopped. With his hat in his hand and his head down, looking at a particular spot on the ground near the horse stalls. Clara recognized that particular kind of stillness. She had seen it in people who have lost someone, the way grief sometimes just takes hold without warning, in an ordinary place, on an ordinary afternoon, and holds you there for a moment before you can get yourself moving again. She stepped back behind the partition quietly. She continued counting bales. She gave him 3 minutes before she made a noise with the inventory papers. Not loud, just audible. A signal that she was there so he could collect himself before he had to be seen. When she came around the partition a few minutes later, he was moving, checking a bridle that didn't need checking, and his face was arranged back into its usual working expression. "Feed inventory's worse than last year," she said, looking at her notes. "I want to talk to the Harmon farm about supplemental hay before the first hard freeze." "Harmon drives a hard bargain," Ethan said. "So do I," Clara said. There was a beat of silence. She kept her eyes on her notes. "I know," he said. And there was something in the way he said it. Not warm, still Ethan, still the man who communicated mostly in the space between sentences, but different from the early weeks. Something that had moved slightly toward something she didn't have a word for yet. She didn't push it. She wrote down the note about Harmon and moved on. But she filed it. In her internal ledger, in the drawer that was getting harder to keep organized. November brought the first real storm, and with it a test Clara had not seen coming. It happened on a Thursday, the kind of morning that started wrong, the kind where the light outside is a particular shade of gray that experienced people in cold country recognize, where the temperature has dropped fast overnight, and the wind has changed direction, and you know, in some animal way, that the weather is gathering itself for something. Clara had the kitchen heated and breakfast on before first light, because she had developed the habit of being ready before anyone needed her to be ready. The ranch hands came through in rotating groups, muddy, taciturn, smelling of cold air and animals. And she fed them without commentary, and they ate without commentary, and this was a functional relationship that suited everyone. Ethan came in last, as usual, and stood at the window with his coffee for a moment before he said, "Caleb's going out with the South Pasture crew today. Storm's coming, and we need to move the cattle to the lower fields before it hits." Clara said nothing, because this was not information that required her response. "He knows what he's doing out there," Ethan said to the window. "He's been riding with the crew since he was 12. "I know," Clara said. Ethan turned. He looked at her. "You're worried about him," she said. A silence. "He pushes too hard when he's trying to prove something," Ethan said finally. "Always has. What's he trying to prove today?" The silence this time was different, longer. Ethan looked back at the window. "That he doesn't need anyone to worry about him," he said. Clara looked at the back of his head, at the set of his shoulders, and she understood, quickly, with the accuracy that came from a lifetime of watching people in difficult circumstances, that Ethan Blackwood was a man who had organized himself so completely around the necessity of holding things together that he had left no room in that structure for the things that were falling apart. He was carrying a great deal, more than he showed, more probably than he admitted to himself. She turned back to the stove. "Caleb will be fine," she said. "He's got his father's judgment. He just doesn't know it yet." A beat of silence from behind her. "You can't know that," Ethan said, which was, she recognized, exactly what Caleb had said to her about her intention to stay. It was apparently a family approach to uncertainty. "No," she agreed, "but I've been watching him for 5 weeks. He's careful under pressure. He argues with everything, but he doesn't do anything stupid." She paused. "He just needs to figure out that being careful isn't the same as being weak." She heard Ethan set his cup down. She thought he was going to say something. He didn't. He put on his coat and hat and went out, and the kitchen was quiet again, and Clara stayed at the stove and thought about nothing in particular for a long moment. Then she got on with the day. Caleb came back with the South Pasture crew at dusk, before the storm hit properly. The cattle were in the lower fields. Nobody had gotten hurt. He came through the kitchen on his way to the barn, still in his cold weather gear, and stopped when he saw Clara at the table with the evening accounts. He looked at her for a moment. Clara looked up from the ledger. "Your father was worried about you," she said. Caleb's expression shifted, that quick internal movement she'd been learning to read. "He doesn't say that," Caleb said. "No," Clara agreed. "He stood at the kitchen window for a long time this morning." Something happened in Caleb's face, brief, uncontrolled, the kind of emotion that gets through before the defenses catch up. "He does that," Caleb said, quietly. "I know," Clara said. And she went back to the accounts, and Caleb stood there for another moment, and then he went on through to the barn, and Clara sat in the warm kitchen with the sound of the approaching storm against the windows and thought, a little, just a little, not one, not trusted, not anything as large as those words, but a little. The storm hit overnight and lasted 2 days, and during those 2 days the household was reduced to its essential elements: warmth, food, the maintenance of the animals, and the particular forced closeness of people who cannot go anywhere and must therefore simply be where they are. Clara baked through most of it. It was partly practical, the bread, the pies, the biscuits that the ranch hands went through at a rate that required constant replenishment, and partly because she thought better when her hands were busy, and she had a great deal to think about. On the second afternoon, Rose came and climbed onto the stool and held out her hands without preamble, and Clara put dough in front of her, and they worked together in silence that was by now a comfortable thing between them. "Mrs. Whitmore," Rose said to her portion of dough. "Yes?" "Are you happy here?" Clara kept her hands moving. She thought about how to answer this with the honesty the question deserved and the care the questioner deserved, because Rose was 6 years old, and she was asking because it mattered to her, not because she was making conversation. "I think I'm becoming happy here," Clara said. "It's different from being happy right away. Sometimes things take time to become what they're going to be." Rose considered this. "I didn't like you at first," Rose said. "I know," Clara said. "I don't not like you now," Rose said carefully, in the particular grammar of someone who has not quite decided on the positive version yet. "That's enough for now," Clara said, and she meant it. The storm ended, the roads cleared, and the ordinary work of the ranch resumed. But something had shifted in those 2 days, imperceptibly, the way seasons shift, in that way where you can't point to the exact moment, but you can tell, looking back, that something has changed. The children moved differently around Clara now. Henry had stopped treating her like a guest he was being nice to and started treating her like a fixed feature of the house, comfortable, unremarkable, simply present. Rose had begun appearing in the kitchen not just when Clara was there, but when she herself wanted to be there, as though the kitchen had become, in some small way, hers too. May still held some things back, but she held fewer of them, and she offered her opinions more often. And once, just once, on a Sunday afternoon, Clara caught her smiling at something Clara said before she had time to stop herself. Caleb remained the wall, But the wall had cracks in it now, hairline thin, and Clara did not push at them. She just noted where they were. And Ethan. Ethan was the thing she didn't know what to do with. He was present in the household in a way that was different from the early weeks. Not warmer, exactly. She did not think warmth was a natural register for him, any more than silence was for other people. But more, there. More aware of her as a specific person with specific qualities, rather than an arrangement he'd made and then absorbed into the functioning of his days. He had started asking her opinion on things, not the household accounts, that had been the original arrangement, but other things, whether the south pasture fence was worth repairing before winter or should wait until spring, whether the bunkhouse needed a second stove. Questions that had, on their surface, practical answers, but that required the kind of judgment that comes from having watched something closely and thought about it carefully. He asked them in the morning, usually, at the kitchen window with his coffee. Clara answered them plainly, because she had established early that plain was how he communicated best. One morning in late November, he stood at the window longer than usual and then said, without preamble, "I'm going to tell you something, and I'm telling you because I think you should know it, not because I want anything from you about it." Clara looked up from the accounts. "All right," she said. "I didn't go to that auction to find a wife," he said. "I wasn't looking for any of this." He said it without apology, just as information. "I was there to settle a debt with the agency. I'd agreed to take a placement 18 months ago, and then the whole thing fell through, and they were owed a fee, and I was going to settle it and leave." Clara waited. "I heard what Pemberton said to you up there," he said. Pemberton was the auctioneer. "And I heard what you said back." A silence. "Why?" Clara asked. It was the whole question compressed into one word. Why did that make you walk up? Why me, of all the available choices? What calculation did you make in that moment? Ethan looked at the window. "Because you were angry," he said. "You were standing up there in front of all those people who were laughing at you, and you were angry, not broken, not begging, just angry, and you were doing something with it." A pause. "Keeping it useful." Clara looked at him. "My wife did that," he said to the window. "She had that. Whatever that is, when a person's knocked down and they don't perform the knocking down, they just get back up and keep working. She had it until—" He stopped. Started again. "I recognized it. The kitchen was very quiet." "That's all," he said. "I just thought you should know why." He put his cup down and put on his hat and went out. Clara sat at the kitchen table for a long moment without moving. Then she looked down at the accounts. Then she looked at the window where he'd been standing. Then she went back to work, because there was work to do, and because she needed something to do with her hands while she figured out what to do with what she was feeling, which was large and specific, and not a thing she had the language for yet. Outside, the Montana sky was wide and colorless and cold, and the ranch went about its business, and somewhere in the south pasture Caleb was riding with the crew, and in the front room Rose was attempting to teach the cat a trick. It had no interest in learning. And May was at the table in the hallway, writing in a notebook she kept private, and Henry was probably in the barn explaining his rock collection to a ranch hand who had not asked to be educated. And Clara Whitmore, who had arrived in this place with a worn suitcase and $30 and the specific determination of someone who has run out of alternatives and decided that was fine, sat in the kitchen that was slowly becoming hers and thought, "I am building something here." She didn't know yet exactly what it was, but she knew what building felt like. She knew what it felt like to lay the first stones in ground that wasn't easy, and to feel them hold and to understand that the thing you were making was going to take longer than you thought and be different from what you planned and be real in the end. Real in the end. That was enough. She finished the accounts, started the supper, and when Rose wandered in an hour later with the cat still indifferent behind her, Clara made room at the table without being asked, and the afternoon moved on around them, ordinary and specific and hers. December came in hard and stayed hard. The kind of cold that didn't just settle on the land but pressed into it, working its way through the walls of the house in the hours before dawn, finding every gap in the window frames, every place where the insulation had thinned. Clara had been in Montana long enough now to understand that winter here was not a season so much as a condition. a permanent state of resistance that required the household to push back constantly or lose ground. She pushed back. The wood supply had been her first concern coming out of the November storm, and she'd been right to worry about it. Ethan's crew had cut and stacked through the autumn, but not enough. Not for a winter that was shaping up to be worse than the last one, according to the men who paid attention to such things, who watched the behavior of animals and the early freeze of the creek and the particular quality of the October sky, and read from those things what was coming. Clara listened to these men. She added their estimates to her own calculations, and then she added 20% on top of that because she had learned that people who had never truly run short of something always underestimated how bad running short felt. She sent a note to the Harmon farm about additional cordwood before the roads got any worse. Harmon came himself, which she hadn't expected, and he sat at the kitchen table with his hat in his hands and tried to charge her twice what the wood was worth. Clara sat across from him and did not raise her voice. "Mr. Harmon," she said, "you've been supplying this ranch for 11 years. And I'm sure in those 11 years there have been seasons when the Blackwoods paid more than they should have because nobody was keeping careful track." She pushed a sheet of paper across the table. "I'm keeping track now. This is what cordwood is selling for in Harlan Creek, and this is what it's selling for in Billings, and this is what you charged the Henderson Ranch last month, because Mrs. Henderson and I have become acquainted, and she is a very forthcoming woman." She tapped the paper. "I would like a fair price." Harmon looked at the paper. He looked at her. He was a large man, red-faced, accustomed to getting his way by volume and impatience. "The roads are getting bad," he said. "Delivery costs are included in my calculation," Clara said. "Third column." A silence. Harmon picked up his hat. "I'll do the Billings rate plus 10% for delivery," he said. The surrender was in his voice. Not gracious, but real. "Plus 5%, Clara said, "and I'll need it by Friday." He left looking like a man who had arrived expecting to fleece someone and instead found himself agreeing to something reasonable, which was worse somehow than just losing, because he couldn't even complain about it properly. The wood arrived Thursday, Mrs. Sutt. Aldridge watched the delivery from the kitchen window with the particular expression she'd developed for moments when Clara did something she approved of, but wasn't going to say she approved of. "You should have been a lawyer," she said. "I've thought about it," Clara said, and meant it, and went back to the supply accounts. The arrangement between Clara and Ethan had settled into something that defied easy categorization. They were not a conventional married couple. They shared a house and a name and a financial partnership and very little else, and neither of them pretended otherwise. But they were also not simply employer and employee, and had not been for some time, and the space between those two definitions was where they lived. He ate supper with the family most evenings now, which she gathered had not always been the case. Before she came, Caleb had told her once, in the brief, factual way he was beginning to offer things, that his father used to eat in his office 3 nights out of 5, and that the children had gotten used to it. Now he was at the table, and he asked questions about the children's days with the slightly effortful quality of a man who knows he ought to do this and is practicing getting better at it. Clara did not call attention to the effort. She just made sure the supper table was a place worth being. Henry helped with this, being constitutionally incapable of a silent meal. Rose sat next to Clara with reliable regularity now, close enough that their arms sometimes touched. May had begun setting the table without being asked, which was a choice. She could have left it to Mrs. Aldridge. And Clara understood that it was May's way of participating in something she hadn't fully accepted yet but was trying on for size. And Caleb. Caleb was the thing she kept returning to, because he was the most complicated and the most important, and she knew that what happened between them would matter beyond just the two of them. He was the oldest. He had held this family together through 2 years of loss and instability and transient housekeepers, and he had done it by deciding that nobody new was going to get close enough to matter, and that if he treated each new arrangement as temporary, it would hurt less when the temporary thing ended. He was wrong about her. She knew that. But knowing it and getting him to know it were different projects, and she was not going to force it. What she did instead was this. She treated his opinions as worth considering, not performing it, actually doing it. When Caleb said the south barn roof needed attention before the next heavy snow, she went and looked at the south barn roof herself and found he was right and told Ethan so. when he had a disagreement with one of the ranch hands about the cattle rotation schedule. She asked him to explain his reasoning to her, and she listened properly, and she told him where she thought he was right and where she thought he might be missing something, and she did not soften either assessment. He had not expected that. She could tell by the way he went still when she disagreed with him, not the stiffening of someone about to argue, but the stillness of someone recalibrating. "You think I'm wrong about the Henderson boundary," he said one afternoon. They were in the barn, and he had been telling her about a long-running dispute over grazing rights on the eastern edge of the Blackwood land, and Clara had listened all the way through and then said she thought his read of the situation missed something. "I think you're right about the facts," she said. "The boundary markers support you, but you're reading Henderson as someone who wants to win the argument. I think he wants the water access, and the argument is just how he's going after it." Caleb was quiet. "What's the difference?" he said finally. "If he wants to win an argument, you beat him by being right," Clara said. "If he wants the water, you beat him by giving him a different way to get it so the argument becomes pointless." She looked at him. "Does the Eastern Creek run through your land, or does it just border it?" A beat. "Borders it," Caleb said slowly. "Mostly." "Then there might be a way to give Henderson seasonal access to the bordering section that doesn't cost you anything meaningful and takes away his entire reason for pushing the boundary dispute." Silence. "He'd never go for it," Caleb said. "Maybe not," Clara said, "but it's worth knowing whether he would before you spend another year fighting over survey markers." Caleb looked at her for a long moment with those steady eyes. "You think like a man," he said. He meant it as a compliment. He had not yet learned enough about her to know she would not take it as one. "I think like someone who's had to solve problems with very few resources," she said evenly. "That's not a man thing or a woman thing. It's just what happens when you can't afford to fight the wrong battle." He took that in. He didn't apologize. She hadn't expected him to, and didn't need him to. But she could see him thinking, which was enough. They left the barn separately, and Clara went back to the kitchen, and she put the Henderson water situation in the back of her mind where she kept things that needed more time, and she got on with the day. It was the Saturday before Christmas when Marcus Vale arrived in Harlan Creek. Clara did not know this immediately. She found out the way she found out most things about the wider world beyond the ranch, through the specific, reliable channel of Henry, who absorbed information from the town the way dry ground absorbed rain. He came back from an errand with Mrs. Aldridge in a state of barely contained agitation that he was attempting, with limited success, to conceal. "There's a man at the hotel," he said from the kitchen doorway, in the too casual tone of someone who has decided they are going to mention something but wants to see how it lands before they commit to the full version. Clara was rolling pastry dough. "There are several men at the hotel, I would imagine." This one was asking about the Blackwood Ranch. Henry came in and sat down without being invited, which was so normal now it wasn't even a thing she noticed. "Mrs. Aldridge said I shouldn't say anything." "Then maybe you shouldn't," Clara said. Henry was quiet for a moment, which was unusual enough that it worked as emphasis. "He was asking about you specifically," he said. Clara's hand stilled on the pastry. She knew. She didn't know how she knew. She hadn't heard a name, hadn't seen a face, had only Henry's second-hand report of a man at a hotel asking questions. But she knew the way you know a smell that your body has cataloged without your permission, the way a specific quality of alarm rises in a person who has had cause at some earlier point in their life to be afraid. She kept her face arranged. "Did Mrs. Aldridge hear his name?" she asked. "He said it was Vale," Henry said. "Marcus Vale." The pastry was going to be overworked. She made herself stop pressing and just let her hands rest. "What did Mrs. Aldridge tell him?" "She said she didn't know any Whitmore woman. She said she'd never heard the name." Henry was watching her now, the uncomplicated attentiveness of a child who knows something is wrong and is trying to understand what. "Clara, do you know who he is?" She looked at him. He was 9 years old and he had lost his mother, and he had let her in when he didn't have to, and she was not going to lie to him directly. "Yes," she said. "Is he dangerous?" She thought about the honest answer to that question, about what Marcus Vale was and what he had been and what he was capable of. about the 3 years she had spent in his orbit, not as a wife, not as anything with a clean name, and what it had cost her to leave, and how she had left, and what he had said to her when she did. "He was," she said. "I don't know what he is now." Henry nodded. This was apparently enough for him. Or perhaps he recognized that more questions would not be helpful and had decided to absorb what he had. He was an unusually good reader of situations for his age. "I won't say anything," he said. "Don't tell your father yet," Clara said. "I need to think first." Henry looked at her steadily. "Okay," he said. And he meant it, and she knew he would keep it, and she was simultaneously grateful for his reliability and aware that she was asking a 9-year-old to hold something he shouldn't have to hold, and that this was wrong, and that she would fix it. She just needed to think first. Marcus Vale. She had met him in Duluth in the year after the mill, when she had been at her lowest point. Not dramatically low, not the kind of low that makes a story, just the grinding, colorless low of someone who has run out of choices and is executing a plan that isn't working. She had been working in a laundry. He had been charming in the way of men who have practiced charm the way other people practice a trade, deliberately, with an understanding of what it was for. He was not violent. That was the thing that had confused her for a long time about what he was. He didn't hit. He didn't threaten, not directly. What he did was arrange things. He arranged her circumstances so that leaving became harder and staying seemed like the only practical option. He borrowed money from her and didn't repay it. He moved into her boarding house room, and the landlady assumed they were married and would only renew the lease in his name. He told her story to people in ways that made her past sound worse than it was, so that she felt, gradually, like the version of herself that existed in his account was the one other people saw, and that version was someone who needed him. She had understood what was happening for about a year before she did anything about it, because understanding and being able to act are not the same thing. And then one morning she had woken up before him, and she had packed what she could carry, and she had left. She had taken the agency letter with her because she'd been keeping it in her coat pocket for 3 months, waiting for the moment. She had walked out of Duluth with $43 and a worn suitcase and the letter, and she had not looked back. She had thought she was clear. She had told herself the distance was enough. She had been wrong. She needed to tell Ethan. She knew this. She had known it, in some form since the moment Henry said the name. She had put off knowing it for the length of time it took her to roll out the pastry and put it in the oven and wash her hands and dry them and stand at the kitchen window looking at the yard. But she had always known it. The question was how. She had not told him anything about her history with Marcus, because the arrangement between them had not required it. She had been honest about her circumstances, had described herself as someone escaping poverty and limited options, which was true, which was the shape of the truth without the specific weight of it. She had not lied. She had just not gone further than she had to. Now she had to go further. She found him in the office after supper with the door open, which she had learned meant he was available. "I need to tell you something," she said from the doorway. He looked up from the papers on his desk. She came in and sat down in the chair across from him, the chair she'd sat in to look at the ledger books on her first week, which already felt like a different time. And she told him. Not all of it. Not every detail. But the shape of it. Marcus, Duluth, the 3 years, the leaving, the distance she had tried to put between herself and that life. She told it plainly, without decorating it in either direction, because she was not trying to make herself look better than she was, and she was not trying to ask for anything specific. She was just telling him what he needed to know. When she finished, the office was quiet. Ethan was looking at the papers on his desk, not reading them, just looking at a fixed point. "He's in Harlan Creek," he said, "at the hotel, as of today." "How long has he been looking for you?" "I don't know. Long enough to track me here." A silence. "You should have told me this before," he said. "Yes," she said. She did not explain it further because there was no explanation that made it better, and she understood that. She had made a calculation back in October when she arrived about how much of her history to disclose, and she had made it wrong, and the honest thing was to own it. Ethan was quiet for a long moment. "Is he going to come to the ranch?" he said. "I don't know. He might. He has a particular sense of ownership over things he thinks belong to him. I've never quite fit his category of things that can leave. Another silence. What do you need? Ethan said. Clara looked at him. She wasn't sure what she had expected. More questions, maybe? Or the particular kind of cold anger that some men produced when they discovered they had been given incomplete information, the anger that was really about control. She had prepared herself for a version of this conversation that was more difficult than the one she was having. I don't need you to fix it, she said carefully. I'm not asking that. I didn't ask what you weren't asking, he said. I asked what you need. She was quiet for a moment. I need to know that you know, she said, so that if he comes here, you're not caught off guard. She paused. And I need to know what you want to do with it. What do you mean? If this is too complicated, if having him here creates problems for the ranch, for the family, I understand that. I came here without disclosing this, and you had a right to know it, and you didn't. And if you feel like that changes the arrangement, I understand that too. She said it evenly. She was proud of the evenness, because underneath it was something considerably less even. The old, banked fear that she had learned to keep out of her voice. The fear that had followed her from Duluth, and that she had thought she had outrun. Ethan looked at her across the desk. Clara, he said. It was the first time he had used her name in 2.5 months. The arrangement doesn't change, he said. Nothing changes. He said it simply, without drama, the way he said everything. What changes is that I know about it now. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she nodded. She stood up and went back to the kitchen, and she stood at the stove and breathed and let what had just happened settle. He had not offered comfort. He had not touched her or softened his voice or given her any of the things a different kind of person would have led with. He had just told her, the arrangement doesn't change, in the flat, certain tone of a man who had decided something and was done deciding it. She had not known, until that moment, how badly she had needed to hear something that simple. Marcus came to the ranch 4 days later. He arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, which was not the dramatic timing Clara had been half expecting. She had been preparing herself for a night arrival, for something designed for maximum disruption. Instead, he came in the middle of the day, when the sky was flat and white and the cold sat on everything, and he rode up in a hired buggy with his hat pushed back the same way he always had, and he looked exactly the same as the last time she had seen him. That was the thing about Marcus. He looked like someone harmless. He had the face and the manner of a man it would be easy to trust, open, good-natured, the kind of man who remembered names and asked after wives and children and made you feel, within 5 minutes, like you had known him a long time. Clara was at the kitchen window when the buggy came up the road. She watched him come. She felt the old response in her body, the tightening in her chest, the particular alertness that was just below fear, and she let herself feel it for a moment, and then she set it aside. She had spent 3 years afraid of Marcus Vale, and she was done with it, and the fact that her body hadn't gotten the message yet was simply information, not instruction. She went to the front door. She opened it before he could knock. He saw her and a smile spread across his face, the warm, rueful, familiar smile that she had once believed was genuine and now read like text she already knew by heart. Clara, he said, as if they'd seen each other last week, as if this was a reunion. Marcus, she said. She stayed in the doorway. Come on now, he said. Don't be like that. I've come a long way. I know, she said. That's not my problem. His smile shifted, fractionally, barely visible, the warmth adjusting itself into something that still looked like warmth. You don't have to be unfriendly, he said. I just want to talk. You could have written. I wanted to see you. And I didn't want to be seen, she said. That's why I left. He looked at her for a long moment, and underneath the easy manner she could see the things she had learned to look for. The calculation, the constant running assessment of what leverage was available and how to use it. You took things when you left, he said. I took my own belongings, she said. There's some disagreement about that. You're the only one who disagrees, she said, and you're not reliable on the subject. His eyes went past her into the house, and she resisted the urge to move into that space, to physically block his view, because that would show him something about where her fear was concentrated. "Nice place," he said. "Bigger than I expected." The words were easy and light, but she heard the architecture underneath them. "I know where you are now. I know what you have to lose." "What do you want, Marcus?" "I want to have a conversation," he said, "like adults, about how things ended between us and what might be fair." "There's nothing fair in what you're describing," she said. "You want money. That's what this is." He looked hurt. He was very good at looking hurt. "You always assumed the worst." "I assumed what the evidence supported," she said, "and I was usually right." Behind her, she heard footsteps on the stairs. She didn't turn around because she didn't want to take her eyes off Marcus, but she knew from the sound whose they were. Caleb came to stand in the hallway, just visible over Clara's shoulder. He was 16 and lean, and he had his father's eyes, and whatever else he had thought about Clara in the past 2.5 months, he clearly did not like what he was reading in this situation, because his face was set in the way she had come to recognize as his version of his father's expression. Controlled, deliberate, watching. Marcus saw him. The calculation recalculated. "I'll be in town a few days," Marcus said to Clara pleasantly. "We'll have more time to talk." "We won't," she said. "Whatever you came here to do, stop. Just stop. You have no claim on me, and you know it. And whatever you think you can get from this, you are wrong." He looked at her for a moment with the warmth fully gone from his eyes, which was the truest version of him, the version that existed when the performance ran out. "You always did overestimate yourself, Clara," he said, quietly, like a confidence. "That was always your problem." She held the door. He turned and went back to the buggy. She closed the door and stood with her hand on the frame and breathed. "Who is he?" Caleb's voice. Behind her. She turned. He was looking at her with those steady eyes, and she understood from his face that he had read more from that exchange than she had said out loud. "Someone from before," she said. "He's not going to leave," Caleb said. It was not a question. "No," she agreed. "He's not." A silence. "Pa knows?" Caleb said. "Yes." He nodded once, slowly, the gesture of someone filing information and deciding what to do with it. "What do you need?" he said. It was the same question Ethan had asked her, the same words, the same directness. She looked at Caleb, this boy who had told her on her first day that she wouldn't last, who had treated her as temporary for weeks, who was standing in his family's hallway, asking her what she needed. And she felt something shift in the space between them that was substantial and real. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. He nodded again. "Then figure it out," he said. "And when you do, tell us." He went back upstairs. Clara stood in the hallway for a moment, and then she went to find Ethan. What followed was a week of a particular kind of tension that Clara had no precise name for. Not the acute tension of immediate danger, but the drawn, wearing tension of waiting for something you know is coming and cannot fully predict. Marcus was still at the hotel. She knew this through the same channel she knew most things. Henry, who had apparently appointed himself a small intelligence operation and was reporting in with regular updates delivered in the tone of someone who found the whole situation interesting, which was preferable to frightened. Marcus came to town meetings. He introduced himself around. He was charming and easy and told people he was an old friend of Mrs. Blackwood's passing through, and several people seemed to enjoy him, which did not surprise Clara. He had always been good at rooms. Victoria Ashford enjoyed him most. This did not surprise Clara either. She heard about it from May, who had a network of information sources among the girls in town that she deployed with more sophistication than most adults Clara had known. "Mrs. Ashford has had him to dinner twice," May said, in the dry tone she had recently developed for reporting things she found interesting and irritating in equal measure. "He told her you were his cousin." "I'm not his cousin," Clara said. "I know," May said. "What is he?" Clara considered the question. "A mistake I escaped from," she said. May absorbed this. "People keep calling him your friend," she said. The quotation marks were audible. "He calls himself that," Clara said. "He thinks of it as a long-term strategy." "For what?" "For making it seem strange that I'm not glad to see him." May looked at her with the narrow, clear-eyed look of a 13-year-old who understands more about social mechanics than most adults give credit for. "That's disgusting," she said. "Yes," Clara agreed. "What are we going to do about it?" Clara noticed the "we" and noted it carefully in the internal ledger, in the same drawer as Caleb's "What do you need?" and Ethan's "Nothing changes," where she was keeping the things she needed to remember. "I'm working on it," she said. And she was, because she had learned over the years and over these months that the people who won against men like Marcus Vale did not win by confronting them directly. Marcus was too skilled at confrontation, too practiced at making himself look reasonable, and his opponents look unreasonable. The way to beat him was through documentation, through witnesses, through building a case so thorough and so well placed that when she moved against him, there was nowhere for the charm to go. She had been keeping notes since the day he arrived, dates, times, words, where she could record them accurately. She had written to the agency in Duluth, carefully, in terms that made it seem like a general inquiry about regulatory records, asking for anything on file under his name. She had also done something she had not told Ethan about yet. She had written to the sheriff's office in Duluth. She did not know what they had on Marcus Vale, if anything. She did not know if there were complaints, records, anything that could be used. She just knew that when a man like Marcus traveled to find a woman who had left him, he rarely did it because he had nothing better to do, and that whatever he wanted was probably worth considerably more to him than the energy of a long journey from Duluth to Montana suggested, which meant there was something she didn't know yet. She needed to know it. The reply from Duluth arrived on a Thursday, 10 days after Marcus Vale had arrived in Harlan Creek, and it arrived on the same day as the fire. She did not read the letter before everything changed. The evening started with supper, which was ordinary. Ethan at the table, all 4 children, Mrs. Aldridge making her slow way around the kitchen. Caleb was quieter than usual, which Clara had noticed in the days since Marcus arrived. He was doing the same thing she was doing, watching, measuring, keeping his own counsel. She had not said anything to him about it because she did not want to put more weight on him than was already there. After supper, Ethan went to the barn to check on a mare that was close to foaling. The ranch hands had retired to the bunkhouse. The children were in their rooms. Clara was at the kitchen table with the Duluth letter, unopened, and the rest of the week's accounts, and she had poured herself tea, and she was about to reach for the letter when she smelled it. Smoke. Not wood smoke. Not the smell of the kitchen stove or the fireplaces. Something sharper and bigger, the smell of something catching that was not supposed to catch, and underneath it a quality of heat that was wrong for the house. She was outside in seconds. The main cattle barn, not the horse barn, the large one, the heart of the operation, was lit from the inside with an orange glow that should not have been there, and the glow was growing, and as she stood there, the first flame punched through the roof in a column that turned her face hot even at that distance. She screamed for the ranch hands. She screamed for anyone who was in earshot. She kept screaming while she ran toward the barn because she could hear the cattle inside. That particular low-gathered panic of animals that know something is wrong and cannot get out. And she knew that Ethan was in there. She could hear him, or she thought she could. Through the noise of the fire, through the shouting of the ranch hands who were pouring out of the bunkhouse, through the sound of the cattle, she thought she heard a voice, and then she didn't, and she ran. The ranch hands tried to hold her back. 2 of them had her by the arms, and she was stronger than they expected, which did not surprise her and clearly surprised them. And she said, not screamed, said in a voice that came from somewhere very far below panic, "Ethan is in there." And they held her anyway, because they were men and she was a woman and the barn was on fire, and that was the calculus they made. So she stopped fighting them. She stopped fighting them and she went still, and they loosened their grip slightly because the stillness was convincing, and then she pulled free and ran. She went around the back of the barn, not through the main doors where the fire was worst, but around to the side because she had been in this barn every week for 2.5 months, and she knew there was a secondary door on the north wall that was usually kept latched but not locked, that led to the section where the tack was stored, which was not where the main fire was. The door was hot when she touched it. She used her coat to pull it open. The inside was chaos, smoke and heat, and the sound of terrified animals and the orange light that came from the far end, where the fire had taken the main structure. She could see the cattle moving in the darkness, the barrier gate that was keeping them penned, and she understood in an instant that whoever had started this fire had also done something to the release mechanism on the main gates, because it should have been open by now. The hands should have gotten it open. She had heard them trying, and the cattle were still in. She went to the secondary pen release, the one on the north side, the one that would push the animals out through the back rather than the main entrance. And it was stiff from disuse. She'd noted it before and meant to address it, and she worked at it with both hands while the heat built around her and the smoke made it hard to see. It gave. The cattle poured through the opening in a mass that nearly knocked her off her feet, and she pressed herself against the wall to let them through. And the rush of their bodies going past was terrifying, and also, she was out of the way. She was still standing. She was still thinking. She heard him before she found him. A cough, rough and low, from the far corner where the fire had not yet reached, but the smoke was thickest. Ethan was on the ground. She did not know how he'd gotten there. A beam, probably. Something in the early moments of the fire. He was conscious but barely, trying to get up, and one look told her he wasn't going to manage it on his own. She didn't stop to think about it. She had never been small, and she had never been weak, and she had spent her whole life doing the work that needed to be doing. And right now the work that needed doing was getting Ethan Blackwood to his feet and out of this barn before the roof came down. She got under his arm. He was heavy, working man heavy, muscle and bone. And she was not going to manage it gracefully, and she didn't try to. She just moved, one step and then the next, back toward the north door, toward the cold air she could feel coming in around the frame. And she kept moving because stopping was not available as an option. The roof over the main section came down behind them with a sound like the world splitting, and the heat of it pushed against their backs like a hand, and Clara moved faster and did not look back. They came through the north door into the cold air and the dark yard, and the ranch hands were there immediately. She heard shouting, felt hands taking Ethan's weight from her, felt the cold hit her face with the specific relief of something she had stopped noticing until it was gone. She sat down on the frozen ground. She sat there for what felt like a long time. Around her, the organized chaos of aftermath was already in motion. Men working to keep the fire from spreading to the other buildings. The sound of the horses being moved, Caleb's voice giving instructions with a steadiness that she registered even through the noise and thought. There he is. There's who he is under the rest of it. Someone put a coat around her shoulders. She did not look up to see who. She thought about the letter from Duluth sitting on the kitchen table unopened. She thought about Marcus Vale at his hotel in Harlan Creek. She thought about the fire and the latched gate and the thing that had been done to the release mechanism on the main pen doors, which had not broken on its own, which did not break that way. And she understood, not as suspicion, as certainty, the cold, flat certainty of someone who knows what they know, that this fire was not an accident. And she sat on the frozen ground in the cold Montana night with Ethan's ranch burning behind her, and that certainty in her chest like a coal, and she breathed, and she held it, and she did not let it become panic. Panic was not available. There was too much to do. The doctor came from Harlan Creek before midnight. His name was Pruitt, and he was a small, precise man who smelled of carbolic and did not waste words, which Clara appreciated because she was not in a state to manage unnecessary conversation. He examined Ethan in the bedroom, while Clara stood in the hallway and listened to the sounds from the barn site, the men still working, the occasional shout, the persistent creak and settle of a structure that was no longer a structure. Pruitt came out after 20 minutes. 2 cracked ribs, he said. Smoke inhalation, burns on his left forearm, not deep. He'll need to stay in bed for at least a week and out of cold air longer than that. He looked at her over his glasses. You brought him out? Yes, Clara said. He looked at her hands, which were burned on the palms. Not badly, but visibly, the skin angry and tight from where she'd touched the door and the gate mechanism. Come downstairs, he said. She had not noticed the hands until he pointed at them. That was something she had observed before, in difficult moments, the body's capacity to defer its own accounting until the immediate crisis had passed. She followed Pruitt to the kitchen and sat where he pointed and let him work on her palms without complaint, which required more self-control than the barn had. "The gate mechanism on the main pen," she said, while he worked. "Was it examined before the men cleared the area?" Pruitt glanced up. "I'm a doctor, Mrs. Blackwood." "I know. I'm asking if anyone thought to look at it." He didn't answer, which was an answer. She filed it and moved on. Caleb was in the kitchen when Pruitt left. He was sitting at the table with his coat still on, and his face had the particular quality of someone who had been running on urgency for several hours and was now coming down from it and finding what was underneath. He looked, for the first time in Clara's experience of him, his age. She poured 2 cups of coffee and sat across from him. He wrapped both hands around the cup and looked at the table. "How many cattle?" she asked. "We lost 11, he said. "Could have been worse, a lot worse." He paused. "The hands are saying the main gate release was jammed, deliberately." "I know," Clara said. He looked up. "I knew before the fire," she said. "I should have moved faster. I had the letter from Duluth sitting on the table and I hadn't opened it yet, and She stopped. She made herself stop because recrimination was not useful and there was no version of last night she could go back and change. "I'm sorry. I knew something was likely, and I should have done more, sooner." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "What's in the letter?" he said. "I don't know yet." He looked at the table again. His jaw worked. "He set the fire," Caleb said. Not a question. "I believe so," Clara said. "I don't have proof yet. Getting proof is what comes next." "Pa's going to want to handle it himself," Caleb said. "I know," Clara said. "And he can't. Not the way he'll want to." She looked at Caleb steadily. "The way your father will want to handle Marcus Vale involves riding into town and making his position clear in a way that every man in this county will respect, and that will also get him arrested, because Vale will press charges and the law will support him, and everything your family has built here will be compromised by it." She let that land. "The way I want to handle it is slower and less satisfying and will actually work." Caleb looked at her. "You've thought about this," he said. "Since the day he arrived," she said. The silence between them was different from the silences of the early weeks. Fuller, somehow, less guarded. "Tell me what you need," he said. Third time she'd heard those words from a Blackwood since Marcus arrived. They were becoming a kind of recurring note in a piece of music she was learning to recognize. "In the morning," she said. "Let me read the letter first." She read it at 4 a.m. at the kitchen table, with the house quiet around her and the smell of smoke still faint in the air. The Duluth Sheriff's Office had not written much. It was a short letter, official and careful in the way of bureaucratic correspondence that had been composed by someone aware of what they were committing to paper. But what it contained was enough. Marcus Vale had 2 complaints on file. One from a woman named Harriet Stokes, filed 18 months ago, alleging that he had taken money from her under false pretenses. A loan, supposedly, for a business venture that did not exist. The complaint had not proceeded because Harriet Stokes had subsequently declined to pursue it. The second complaint was more recent. A former business associate named George Parrish had alleged that Vale had forged his signature on a property transfer document. That complaint was still open. Forged documents. Clara read the letter twice, then set it down and looked at the window. Marcus had come to Montana claiming she had taken things when she left. He had used the word things with Ethan's ranch hands in the version of the story he'd been circulating around town, and with the agency woman, and probably with Victoria Ashford over her dinner table. He was building a version of events in which he was a wronged party, and Clara was someone who owed him something. But a man with an open forgery complaint in Duluth was not a man who could afford to have a sheriff look too closely at his affairs. A man like that came to Montana not because he genuinely believed he had a legal claim, but because he believed Clara would pay him to go away rather than risk the disruption. He had miscalculated. Clara was not going to pay him anything. She was going to send a telegraph to Duluth. She wrote the draft at the kitchen table before dawn, clear and specific. She had information relevant to the open parish complaint, including the complainant's current location and the nature of the fraudulent claim he was currently attempting to press in Harlan Creek, Montana. She was prepared to provide a full written statement. She would appreciate knowing whether the Duluth Sheriff's Office wished to coordinate with the Harlan Creek Sheriff on the matter. She read it over twice. Then she added one line at the bottom. Mr. Vale appears to have also committed deliberate arson on the night of December 14th. Witness statements are being collected. She put the draft in her coat pocket and went upstairs to check on Ethan. He was awake. She had not expected that. Pruitt had given him something for the pain that should have kept him under until morning. But he was lying with his eyes open in the darkness, and when she came in, he turned his head toward her. "Sit down," he said. His voice was rough from the smoke. She sat in the chair by the window. "Tell me what you know," he said. She told him. The letter from Duluth, the complaints on file, her reading of what Marcus had come here for and why, the telegraph she planned to send at first light. She told it the way she told him everything, plainly, in order, without performance. When she finished, he was quiet. "The gate mechanism," he said, "jammed deliberately, according to the men. I want someone to document that before anything else is touched." "Caleb," he said. "He'll know who to ask." "I know," she said. "I'll talk to him in the morning." Another silence. "You could have told me about the letter," he said, not angry, just stating a fact. "I was going to," she said. "I was sitting down to read it when the fire started." He accepted this without comment. "You went into the barn," he said. She didn't answer because it seemed like a statement rather than a question. "Clara." The roughness in his voice was not all smoke. "You went into a burning barn." "You were in it," she said. He was quiet for a long moment. "That was a damn fool thing to do," he said. "Probably," she agreed. Outside the window, the sky was beginning to lighten at the edges, the particular gray-pink of a winter dawn in Montana. The barn site was a dark shape against it, the remaining walls and the collapsed roof, the consequence of what Marcus Vale had decided to do when he understood that Clara was not going to be moved by his presence alone. "I want to go to town," Ethan said. "I know," she said. "He set fire to my barn. I know what he did," she said, "and I understand what you want to do about it." She looked at him steadily. "You have 2 cracked ribs and smoke damage in your lungs, and if you ride into Harlan Creek today and do what you want to do, he will press assault charges and you will spend the next month managing a legal situation instead of rebuilding your barn. And he will use that time to finish building his version of events with every person in this county who will listen." She paused. "Let me do this the right way." The silence was long. "What's the right way?" he said. "The telegraph first. Then the sheriff here. But not until I have the response from Duluth. Because right now Vale can claim the fire was an accident and the gate jammed on its own, and we need the Duluth complaint on the record before we walk into that office." She paused. "And witnesses. I need to talk to every man who was at the barn last night about exactly what they saw and when." Ethan looked at the ceiling. "How long?" he said. "Days," she said. "Not weeks." He breathed out slowly, which cost him something given the ribs. "All right," he said. She stood up. "Clara," he said again. She stopped. "Thank you," he said. 2 words, flat and direct, in the way of a man who does not say them often and means them completely when he does. She nodded. She went back downstairs. The telegraph went out at 7 in the morning. Clara sent it herself, riding into Harlan Creek in the cold gray dawn on the horse. She'd been quietly getting comfortable with over the past month, because she had understood since Marcus arrived that there might be a morning when she needed to move fast and couldn't wait for anyone else. The telegraph operator was a young man named Crosby who looked at the message with the barely concealed curiosity of someone in his profession and sent it without comment because Clara's expression was not one that invited comment. She was back at the ranch before the children were up for breakfast. She found Caleb in the barn, the horse barn, intact, the smell of the animals and the hay and the cold, doing morning feed with a thoroughness that told her he'd been at it for a while. She told him what she'd sent and what she was waiting for and what she needed from him. "The men who were first out of the bunkhouse," she said. "Which of them got to the barn first?" "Reardon," Caleb said, "and Hicks. I need to talk to both of them this morning. I need to know exactly what they saw when they arrived at the main doors, whether the gate release had been interfered with, whether there was anything that looked like it had been set deliberately, any smell of accelerant. Caleb nodded. There was kerosene, he said. Reardon said it last night. He could smell it over the smoke. Clara filed this. Kerosene meant someone had brought something to this barn on purpose. Kerosene meant intent. Will they talk to me? She asked. Caleb looked at her. They'll talk to you, he said. It was said simply, without qualification, and the simplicity of it told her something about how the 12 ranch hands of the Blackwood operation were currently thinking about the woman who had pulled their employer out of a burning building. She spent the morning with Reardon and Hicks separately in the kitchen with paper and pen on the table. She wrote down everything they told her in their own words and read it back to them and asked them to confirm it. And at the end she asked them both to sign the account, which they did without being pressured, in the matter-of-fact way of men who understood that what they were doing was important. Henry appeared in the kitchen doorway after Hicks left. "Can I help?" he said. He was 9 years old and he was trying very hard to look like someone who was not frightened. "Come sit with me," Clara said. He came and sat across from her at the table, in the chair that had become, over the past months, something like his chair. "Are we going to be okay?" he said. She looked at him. "Yes," she said. She said it the way she had told him she intended to stay. Not because she could guarantee everything, but because she knew what she intended, and that was the most honest thing she had. "That man," Henry said. "Marcus Vale. Did he start the fire?" "I believe so," she said. Henry was quiet for a moment. "Why?" he said, not accusatory, genuinely trying to understand. "Because he wanted me to feel like I had nowhere to go," she said. "He thought if he took away what I'd built here, I'd have no choice but to give him what he wanted." She looked at Henry steadily. "He was wrong about that. People like him usually are wrong about that because they think the only reason people stay anywhere is because they have no other options. They don't understand the other reason." "What's the other reason?" Henry said. "Because it's theirs," she said. Henry thought about this. "This is yours," he said. "Yes," she said. "It is." He nodded, in the manner of someone who has received confirmation of something he already believed and is glad to have it confirmed. The response from Duluth came the following afternoon. It was longer than Clara had expected. The sheriff there, a man named Aldous Creary, had clearly taken her telegraph seriously and had telegraphed back a substantial reply that Crosby transcribed and delivered to the ranch in person, which told Clara that word of the fire had gotten around town. Creary confirmed the open parish complaint. He confirmed that there were additional matters under investigation that he could not detail in a telegraph, but that her information was directly relevant to. He requested that she preserve all evidence related to the Montana incidents. And he stated, with the economy of a man who had been in law enforcement long enough to know what mattered, that he had already been in communication with the Harlan Creek Sheriff's Office. Clara read this 3 times. Then she went to find Ethan. He was not in bed, which she had expected and which she was not going to argue about, because he was moving carefully and his color was better, and arguing with Ethan Blackwood about what he could and could not do was an exercise she was gradually learning to deploy selectively. He was in his office, sitting at his desk, which was, she understood, about as close to resting as he was capable of. She put the transcribed telegraph on his desk. He read it again. "Creary's already talking to Holt," he said. Holt was the Harlan Creek sheriff, a slow, deliberate man who Clara had met once and assessed as someone who was not fast but was thorough, which was more valuable in the long run. "Yes," she said. "So when we go to Holt, he'll already have context," Clara said. "He'll already know what we're bringing him isn't just a domestic dispute or a woman with a grudge. He'll know there's an open case in Duluth and that the man we're talking about has a pattern." Ethan looked at the telegraph. "When?" he said. "Tomorrow morning," she said. "But I want to do one more thing first." He looked at her. "Victoria Ashford," she said. A beat. "Why?" he said. "Because she's had Marcus at her dinner table twice, and she's been repeating his version of events around town, which means right now there are people in Harlan Creek, who have heard that Clara Blackwood is a woman who steals from people she's been intimate with, and that her husband chose a damaged woman who brought trouble to his door. She said it evenly, without heat, because the heat was not useful. I want to correct that record before we go to Holt. I want to correct it with the person who has been most loudly circulating it. Ethan was very still. She won't like that, he said. No, Clara agreed. She won't. Clara. He said her name with a particular weight. You don't have to. I know, she said. I'm going to anyway. She went to the Ashford Ranch the following morning alone, which was a choice she made deliberately. Taking Ethan would have made it seem like she needed him behind her. Taking Caleb would have made it seem like she needed a man in the room. She needed neither of these things, and she wanted the Ashfords to know it. Victoria received her in the front parlor with a composure that was very nearly convincing. Robert Ashford, Victoria's husband, the cattle rival Henry had mentioned, was not present, which Clara had anticipated. Victoria did not fight her battles with her husband in the room. She fought them herself, which was something Clara could respect even while opposing it. Mrs. Blackwood, Victoria said, I heard about the fire. I'm so sorry. Thank you, Clara said. She sat down without being invited. I'll be brief. Victoria's composure adjusted, a fractional tightening. The man you've had to dinner, Clara said. Marcus Vale. An old acquaintance of yours, he said. He is not my acquaintance, Clara said. He is a man I escaped from 3 years ago who has followed me to Montana. He has an open fraud complaint against him in Duluth. There is a Duluth sheriff who is currently in communication with Sheriff Holt about him, and I have signed witness statements indicating that the fire at the Blackwood barn 2 nights ago was deliberately set. She looked at Victoria steadily. He used your dinner table to build credibility in this town. I want you to know that. A silence. Victoria's composure was still there, but something had shifted underneath it. I didn't know, she started. I understand that, Clara said. He is very skilled at presenting himself. That is essentially his profession. She paused. But you repeated things he told you, about me, about why I came to this county, and what kind of person I am. She let that sit. I would like those things to stop being repeated. The silence was longer this time. Victoria looked at her hands, which were folded in her lap, in the careful way of a woman who has learned to control her physical expression. What he said, Victoria said slowly, about you taking money from him, is false, Clara said. He takes money from people. That is what he does. He took money from a woman named Harriet Stokes in Duluth, and when she filed a complaint, he convinced her to withdraw it. He forged the signature of a man named George Parrish on a property document. He has been in this county for 2 weeks building a story that positions him as the injured party, and you have been one of the mechanisms through which that story has spread. Victoria looked up. There was something in her face that Clara had not expected. Not shame, exactly, but something adjacent to it, an awareness. You should have told people who he was when he arrived, Victoria said, and it came out with some of the old edge, the instinct to position herself on the less embarrassing side of the situation. I was gathering evidence, Clara said, and I was hoping he would leave. He's not going to leave, Victoria said. No, Clara said, which is why I'm going to Sheriff Holt tomorrow morning with everything I have, and why I am here today asking you to stop repeating what he told you, and... She paused, and this was the difficult part, the part that required her to ask for something from someone she did not like. And whether there is anything he said to you specifically about his intentions or about what he wanted from this situation that might be relevant to the case. The silence was the longest yet. Victoria was a woman who moved through the world on a particular set of social coordinates, and those coordinates had served her well, and being asked to hand over information to someone she had spent months positioning herself above was difficult. Claire could see it being difficult, but she also saw something else. Victoria was not stupid, and she had been used, and she knew it, and whatever her faults, and they were various, she did not like being used. He said, Victoria started. She stopped. Started again. He said that you had stolen something from him, documents, that you had taken documents that contained information that didn't belong to you, and that he needed them back. Claire went very still. Documents, she said. He didn't say what kind. Victoria looked at her directly now with the clarity of someone who has made a decision. But he said the documents were worth a great deal of money to someone in Duluth, and that you had taken them to use against him. He said that was why you left. Clara sat with this for a moment. She had not taken any documents from Marcus. She had taken her coat, her suitcase, her $43, and the agency letter. She had taken nothing that belonged to him. But a man facing an open forgery complaint in Duluth, a man who had forged signatures, who traded in false documents, might very well have papers that would be valuable to someone. Incriminating papers. Papers that other people wanted. And if he believed she had them, if he had convinced himself of that, or if he needed to convince others of it, this was why he had come. Not for her. For something he thought she had. "Thank you," Clara said. She meant it. She said it without irony because Victoria had told her something important, and the cost of telling it had been real. Victoria looked at her. "I'm sorry," Victoria said. The words came out with an effort that Clara recognized as genuine. "About what I said at Ethan's house. That first visit." Clara looked at her. "I know what I did," Victoria said. "And I know why I did it. I'm not going to explain it." "I don't need you to," Clara said. She stood up. "If Holt asks to speak with you," Clara said, "I hope you'll tell him what you told me." "I will," Victoria said. Clara rode back to the Blackwood ranch in the cold winter air with 2 new pieces of the picture assembled and the rest of it taking shape. She found Caleb waiting for her at the barn, the horse barn, the intact one, with the look of someone who had been keeping busy in order to not think about things and had run out of things to keep busy with. "How'd it go?" he said. "Better than I expected," she said. He took the horse. She went inside. She went to Ethan's office and told him what Victoria had said, the documents, Vale's claim, her theory about what it meant. Ethan listened without interrupting. "He thinks you have something on him," he said. "He thinks I took papers when I left," she said. "I didn't. But he either believes I did or he's told people I did so often that he's convinced himself." She sat down across from him. Either way, what he was really after was leverage. He wanted to come here and frighten me into giving him something. Money, documents, a signed statement that whatever he has in Duluth is false, and go back with enough to manage his legal situation there. "And when that didn't work," Ethan said. "When that didn't work, he decided to take something instead," she said. "The cattle. The barn. He was trying to hurt you to hurt me. To make me responsible for the damage and guilty enough about it to give him what he wanted." The office was quiet. "He's still at the hotel," Ethan said. "I know. He doesn't know what we have." "Not yet." A beat. "Tomorrow," Ethan said. "Tomorrow," she confirmed. She went to the kitchen and started on supper because it was that time and the family needed to eat, and the routine of the house was itself a form of resistance. The statement that ordinary life continued, that Marcus Vale had burned a barn and not burned anything that actually mattered. May came in and stood beside her at the stove without being asked. She picked up a knife and started on the vegetables without commentary, in the easy, practiced way she'd developed over months of working alongside Clara in this kitchen. "It's going to be over soon," May said, to the vegetables. "Yes," Clara said. "How soon?" "Days." May was quiet for a moment. "I told Lucy Harmon at school," she said, "about the barn. She told her mother, and her mother is apparently telling everyone that the fire was an accident and that you brought a dangerous man to this county." Clara's hand stilled briefly. Then she kept working. "What did you tell Lucy Harmon?" she said. "I told her," May said in the dry, precise voice she'd been developing, "that the man who set the fire is going to be arrested, and that Clara Blackwood dragged my father out of a burning building, and that if her mother had a problem with how things were handled, she was welcome to come speak to me about it personally." Clara looked at her. May looked at the vegetables. "Was that wrong?" May said. "No," Clara said. "I was pretty rude about it," May said. "May," Clara said, "sometimes rude is the right register." Something that was almost a smile moved across May's face before she suppressed it. They finished supper together, and it was the most ordinary thing in the world, and Clara did not take it for granted. Sheriff Holt's office smelled of pipe tobacco and old paper and the particular institutional cold of a building that was heated minimally. He was behind his desk when Clara and Ethan came in the following morning, Ethan moving slowly, wearing the ribs in his measured walk. And he looked at them with the careful, unexcitable expression of a man who had already read a telegraph from Duluth and was not surprised to see them. Clara put everything on his desk. The signed witness statements from Riordan and Hicks, the letter from Duluth, the draft of her telegraph and Creary's response, a written account of Marcus Vale's arrival, his visits to the ranch, his stated claims, and the timeline of the fire. The account of her conversation with Victoria Ashford, which Victoria had agreed to provide in her own hand and which Clara had collected that morning before coming to town. Holt went through all of it with the thoroughness she had anticipated. He asked questions. Good questions, specific, without leading her, the questions of someone building a case rather than someone performing the appearance of building a case. He asked about the kerosene smell, about the gate mechanism, about the exact words Marcus had used on the afternoon he came to the ranch, about the documents Victoria had mentioned. Clara answered everything directly. When he finished, he looked at the pile on his desk for a moment and then at Clara and Ethan. "Mrs. Blackwood," he said, "I want to make sure I understand what you're telling me. You're saying this man came to this county with the intention of extorting money or some form of compliance from you, and when that failed, he committed arson on your property with the likely intention of harming or killing your husband." "Yes," Clara said. "And you have been building this case since the day he arrived," she said. Holt looked at her for a moment. "All right," he said. He stood up. He put on his coat with the unhurried efficiency of a man who had done this before and knew it was going to take as long as it was going to take, and hurrying didn't help. "I'll need both of you available if he disputes any of this in the next day or two." "We're not going anywhere," Clara said. Marcus Vale was arrested that afternoon. Clara was not there to see it. She was at the ranch, at the kitchen table, with the accounts, and a cup of tea that for once she actually finished while it was still warm. She found out from Henry, naturally, who had apparently positioned himself near the hotel with what he described as errands, and what Clara understood to be a 9-year-old intelligence operation conducted on her behalf. "They took him out the front," Henry reported, from the kitchen doorway, with barely suppressed excitement that he was doing a creditable job of trying to manage into something more dignified. He argued with Sheriff Holt. Holt didn't argue back, he just kept moving. "Good," Clara said. "A lot of people saw," Henry said. "Mrs. Ashford was on the street, and Mr. Pemberton." He said the auctioneer's name with a specific satisfaction. Clara thought about the auctioneer on the platform in October. The gavel, the performance, the crowd's laughter. She did not feel triumphant. She felt tired in the specific, substantial way of someone who has been carrying weight for a long time and has just set it down, and the body's first response to that is not relief, but the awareness of how heavy it was. "Henry," she said. He came in and sat across from her. "Thank you," she said, "for everything you've done these past weeks." He blinked. He had not expected to be thanked. He was 9, and people did not usually thank 9-year-olds for things. "I didn't do that much," he said. "You told me when you needed to," she said. That mattered. He looked at the table. He was trying not to look too pleased about this, which was one of his most endearing qualities. "Clara," he said, and then stopped. She waited. "When it's all settled," he said carefully, "are you still going to stay?" She looked at him across the kitchen table, in the house that she had cleaned and reorganized and managed through its first Montana winter, with its repaired railing and its reorganized pantry, and its kitchen that smelled of bread and wood smoke, where Rose followed her between rooms and May revised her letters, and Caleb asked what she needed, and Ethan stood at windows and told her things he had decided she should know. "Yes," she said. He nodded. He stood up. He was almost out of the kitchen before he turned back. "You know," he said, with the particular seriousness he brought to things that mattered to him, "when you first came, I thought Papa had made a mistake." "I know," she said. "I don't think that anymore," he said. He went back to whatever 9-year-olds did on December afternoons in Montana, and Clara sat in the warm kitchen in the last light of the day and held that for a moment before she went back to the accounts, because the accounts still needed doing, And there was still a household to run, and a barn to rebuild, and a cattle operation to put back together. The work didn't stop because things changed. That was the thing about building something. The work was never done. You just kept laying stones, and one day you looked up and realized what you'd made. She was not there yet. There was still a great deal of ground to cover, but she was in it. She was part of it. That was enough for today. Marcus Vail left Harlan Creek in the custody of 2 deputies from Duluth on a Thursday morning in the first week of January. Clara was not at the hotel when they took him. She was at the ranch, in the kitchen, making bread, because the bread needed to be made, and she had learned a long time ago that the moments when justice was finally moving in the right direction were not always the moments that felt the way you expected them to feel. There was no flood of relief. There was no clean conclusion. There was just the ordinary morning, the dough under her hands, the smell of the stove, and the knowledge that something that had been wrong for a long time was being corrected. She had expected to feel more. She felt mostly tired. And then Henry came through the kitchen door with snow on his boots, and his face lit up in a way she had not seen since before the fire, and something loosened in her chest that she had not fully known was tight. "They're gone," he said. Crieri's men took him on the 8 o'clock stage. Sheriff Holt walked them to it. He came in and sat down without taking his boots off, which he usually remembered to do, which told her exactly how much he had been carrying. People were watching from the street. Vail didn't look at anyone. He just kept his head down. Clara shaped the dough and set it to rise. "Good," she said. "Is it really over?" Henry asked. He was trying to sound like someone asking a factual question and not quite managing to conceal that it was much more than that. "The criminal part is," she said, "Holt will still need statements. There may be a hearing if Vail challenges the Duluth charges. It doesn't disappear cleanly." She looked at Henry. "But he's not here anymore, and everything we built to stop him is on record. That doesn't go away either." Henry absorbed this. "Caleb said you thought of everything," he said. "Caleb's being generous," she said. "I miss things. I was slow on the telegraph. I should have gone to Holt the day Vail arrived instead of waiting to build the case." She paused. "You work with what you have, and you try not to repeat the mistakes." Henry looked at her in the way he had when she talked plainly about things, slightly surprised still, even after months, that an adult was telling him how things actually were rather than how adults wished they appeared. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said. He still used it sometimes, the formal address, when something felt important to him. "I'm glad you're here." "So am I," she said, and she meant it in a way she had not fully meant anything in a long time. The barn rebuild started the second week of January. Ethan organized it with the particular focused energy of a man who had spent 2 weeks in enforced rest and was done with it. His ribs were not healed. Pruitt had been clear about the timeline, and Ethan had listened to approximately half of what Pruitt said. But he was moving, directing, out in the cold air with the men every morning, and Clara had stopped trying to argue him back inside because she understood that the barn was not just a structure to him. It was the thing Marcus had taken, and rebuilding it was the thing he needed to do in order to put the fire behind him and move forward. She understood that. She had her own version of it. She had started in the days after Vail's arrest, making notes for something she had been thinking about since October, but had not let herself develop until the immediate situation was resolved. A small commercial bakery in Harlan Creek. Not large, she had no capital for large, but enough. A space, a reliable oven, a weekly schedule of breads and pastries that she would sell to the hotels and the boarding houses and the general store, and eventually, perhaps, to individual households. She had been feeding 12 ranch hands and a family of 6 for 3 months. She knew what she could produce. She knew what the town lacked. She knew the numbers because she had been working with numbers every evening for 3 months, and she understood now, with considerable precision, what a small food operation in a frontier town could sustain. She did not announce this plan. She worked on it in the evening at the kitchen table, the same way she had worked on the ledger books, steadily, without performance, covering ground. It was May who noticed first. "These aren't the ranch accounts," May said one evening, sitting down across from her with the directness she'd been developing since the night she'd corrected the Billings letter. No, Clara said. May looked at the papers. She read numbers the way her mother had apparently taught her, carefully, from the top, not skipping to conclusions. You're planning a bakery? May said. I'm seeing if it's possible, Claire said. May was quiet for a moment. The Henderson bakery closed in September, she said. Mr. Henderson moved to Bozeman. I know, Claire said. That's the space I'm looking at. May looked at the papers again. The startup costs, she said, pointing to a column. Where's this coming from? The supply savings from the first 3 months, Claire said. I talked to your father. He's willing to consider it a loan against future earnings, which is the correct structure because I'm not asking for a gift, and he shouldn't be giving one. May looked up. He agreed to that? He said, and I am quoting this accurately, the numbers make sense. She paused. Which, from your father I have come to understand, is enthusiastic support. Something happened in May's face that had been happening more frequently in recent weeks. An expression that was not quite a smile and not quite something else, but lived warmly between the two. Can I help? May said. With which part? Any of it. Clara looked at her across the table. This girl who had moved the settee back to where her mother had kept it, who had taught Clara how to write to suppliers without sounding accusatory, who had reported May's own version of justice to Lucy Harmon at school with a precision and a loyalty that Clara had not taken for granted for a single day. Yes, Clara said. Specifically, I need someone to help me draft the proposal for the Henderson space, because the owner is still in the county and he's going to try to charge more than it's worth, and I need the letter to be firm without being antagonistic. May pulled the papers toward her. Same problem as the billing supplier, she said. Same principle, Clara agreed. They worked on it together until Mrs. Aldridge came in to tell them both that it was past 10 o'clock and the lamp was expensive. And they went to bed, and the proposal was on the table when Clara came down in the morning, finished, in May's clear handwriting, with a note at the bottom that said, third paragraph. I changed it. Tell me if it's wrong. It was not wrong. The Henderson space was secured at a fair rate in the third week of January. Ethan signed the lease agreement as her guarantor, which was legally necessary and which he did without commentary, setting the pen down and pushing the paper back across the desk, with the same gesture he'd used when he first pushed the ledger books toward her. This is yours now, the gesture said. Figure it out. She figured it out. The first week of February, Clara Whitmore Blackwood opened the smallest bakery in Harlan Creek, in a space that smelled of old flour and cold mortar and needed 2 days of cleaning before it was fit for purpose. She cleaned it herself, with Rose helping in the way Rose helped with everything. Appearing beside her without announcement, and working with a seriousness that Clara had come to understand was how this particular child showed love, through the quiet willingness to be present in the hard parts. The sign above the door was simple. She had not put her name on it. She had put Blackwood's Bakery, which was a decision she had thought about carefully and made deliberately because the name meant something in this county, and she was part of what it meant now. The first morning she opened, she sold out in 2 hours. This was not a triumph. It was a problem. She had underestimated demand, which meant she had not baked enough, which meant she had a line of customers and nothing left to sell them. She sent everyone away with her apologies and spent the rest of the day recalculating her production schedule. She told Ethan that evening. Sold out in 2 hours, she said, and then had to turn people away. He looked at her. That's a good problem, he said. It's still a problem, she said. How long to fix it? 1 week, she said. Maybe 2. I need to adjust the overnight rise schedule and get a second proofing basket. He nodded. Good, he said, and went back to whatever he was reading, and Clara sat across from him at the kitchen table and felt, with sudden and unexpected clarity, that this specific moment, this ordinary evening, this man reading across from her in the lamplight, was something she had not let herself want for a very long time. She did not say anything about it. She went back to her production schedule, but she noted it, in the internal ledger, in a drawer that was getting less careful and more honest with itself every week. The barn was rebuilt by the end of February. It went up faster than Clara had expected, partly because Ethan drove the project with the focused intensity of a man reclaiming something, and partly because 3 neighboring ranchers showed up on the second weekend with their own crews and their own lumber, without being asked. The Harmon farm sent cord wood. The widow Sable from the Eastern Valley sent 2 of her ranch hands for a week. Clara watched this from the kitchen window on the first morning the neighbors arrived, and she thought about what it meant that a community would do this. That people who owed you nothing and had their own work to do would nonetheless show up with their hands and their tools and their time. She had come to this county believing on some level that it was a place where people were judged by the first impression they made and held to it. That had been her experience on the platform in October. She had arrived, and they had looked at her and decided, and she had understood that she was going to have to earn her way out of that first assessment through sustained, daily, visible competence. She had been right about that, but she had been wrong about the community itself. Not wrong that it could be harsh, it could, and the months since October had shown her that repeatedly, but wrong that the harshness was the whole thing. The neighbors who came with their lumber were not the same people who had laughed on the platform. Or maybe some of them were. Maybe people were capable of both things, the cruelty of a first impression and the decency of showing up when something was burning. She was capable of both things herself. That was worth remembering. The formal legal conclusion of the Vale matter came in a letter from Sheriff Creary in Duluth in the second week of March. Marcus Vale had been charged with fraud, forgery, and arson in 2 jurisdictions. He had, apparently, attempted to negotiate a reduction in charges by claiming that Clara had stolen documents from him, the story he had been building since his arrival in Harlan Creek, and Creary had written to ask if she had any response to this claim. She wrote back 3 pages. She had anticipated this. She had kept, since the day she left Duluth, a careful record of what she had taken when she went, her own clothes, her own money, letters addressed to her, and the agency letter. She had kept receipts where she had them. She had kept the boarding house ledger entry in her name. She had, over 3 years, kept every piece of paper that documented her own existence as a separate person from Marcus Vale's version of her. She had not known, when she started keeping these things, that she would need them. She had kept them because she was someone who kept records, because the mill and the boarding house, and a lifetime of being underestimated, had taught her that documentation was the only currency that could not be charmed away from you. She sent the 3 pages to Creary with a note that said, "Please find enclosed a complete inventory of what I removed from the Duluth property in April 1882 with supporting documentation. I am happy to provide notarized copies if needed." She did not hear from Duluth again for 6 weeks. When she did, Creary's letter was brief. Marcus Vale had been convicted on the fraud and forgery charges. The arson charges were still proceeding. He would not be traveling to Montana again. She read the letter at the kitchen table on a Tuesday afternoon in April, with the window open for the first time since November, the smell of the thaw coming through, mud and cold water, and something underneath that was almost green, the suggestion of the season that was starting to happen, whether or not anyone was ready. She folded the letter carefully and put it in the household files, in the drawer where she kept the important papers. Then she went to find Ethan. He was in the yard, talking with Caleb about the spring cattle rotation. She could hear them from the porch, their voices carrying in the way voices carried on a still April afternoon, the particular flat quality of sound in open country. She stood on the porch steps and waited until there was a natural break. Caleb saw her first. He said something to his father that she couldn't hear, and Ethan turned. She held up the letter. He walked over. She gave it to him, and he read it standing in the yard in his coat and hat. The spring mud on his boots, the barn behind him, the new barn, the one that smelled of fresh timber and was slightly larger than the one before it because they had built it to last. He read it twice. He folded it and handed it back to her. "Done," he said. 1 word. But he said it the way he said things that mattered, flat and certain, with the full weight of finality behind it. "Done," she agreed. They stood in the yard for a moment in the thin April sunlight, not saying anything, which was a thing they had gotten better at over the months, the comfortable occupation of the same silence. "I want to tell you something," he said. She waited. "When I walked up to that platform," he said, to a point somewhere over her shoulder in the manner he had when he was saying something he'd been working up to, "I told you it was because of how you handled being knocked down." He paused. That was true, but it wasn't the whole thing. She looked at him. "The whole thing," he said, "was that I had been managing. Since Eleanor. Managing the ranch, managing the children, managing myself. Doing it adequately, keeping everything functional. He was quiet for a moment. And I watched you on that platform, and I thought, that woman is not managing. That woman is still trying. Those are different things. Clara stood in the April yard and held this. I had stopped trying, he said, plainly, without self-pity, in the way he said hard things. I didn't know it until I saw someone who hadn't. She looked at him for a long moment. You're trying now, she said. He met her eyes. I am, he said. It was not a declaration. It was not a romantic speech. It was Ethan Blackwood telling her the truth about himself in the only way he knew how, directly, without embellishment, at some personal cost. She understood it completely. So am I, she said. They walked back to the house together, not touching, in the manner of two people who are moving towards something and are not in a hurry about it, because they have both learned, at some cost, that hurrying toward things you want tends to make them break. The spring arrived the way it always does in Montana. Not gently, not all at once, but in arguments. A warm week followed by a frost. Mud that seemed bottomless and then ground that was almost dry. The cattle moving to the spring pastures in fits and starts, Caleb managing the rotation with a steadiness that had, over the winter, stopped being effortful and started being his natural register. He had changed. Clara had watched it happen, the way you watch seasons change, unable to point to the specific moment but certain, looking back, of the before and after. He still didn't talk much. That was not going to change. It was constitutionally Blackwood. But he talked to her. Not around her, not carefully, but to her, with the directness he gave to people he had decided were worth the effort. He asked her opinion on ranch decisions with genuine curiosity rather than courtesy. He told her things about Eleanor, small things, specific things, the kind of things you only tell someone when you have decided they are part of the story rather than outside it. One afternoon in late April, he came to find her in the bakery. She was there 3 mornings a week now, with a girl from town helping on the busy days, and he stood in the doorway in his work coat and said, without preamble, I need to ask you something. Go ahead, she said, without stopping what she was doing, because she had learned that Caleb spoke more easily when he wasn't being looked at directly. Mama's birthday is in May, he said. The family used to do something, a dinner, something she liked. He was quiet for a moment. Pa stopped after. He stopped again. Henry and Rose don't really remember enough. And May and I, we've been doing it by ourselves, just the two of us in the evening, and it's... He stopped a third time. Clara set down what she was holding. Would it be wrong, he said to the doorway frame, to ask you to be there? This year. She turned and looked at him. He was 16 years old, and he was trying to hold the weight of his mother's memory and his family's grief and the complex, specific thing that was being asked in that question. And he was doing it in the doorway of a bakery in April, in Montana, because he was a Blackwood, and they said the things that mattered in the in-between spaces, not the formal ones. No, she said. It wouldn't be wrong. He nodded. He left without saying anything else. Clara turned back to the counter. She stood there for a moment, and she thought about Eleanor Blackwood, who had planted beans in the shaded corner because she knew they'd come out fine anyway, and who hadn't liked being called Ellie because it sounded like a horse's name, and who had known everything about the kitchen and the garden and the horses and could fix the harness when it broke. The woman whose settee was in the front room where she had put it. The woman whose children Clara had not replaced, could not replace, was not trying to replace. The woman who had built something here and whose building Clara was now part of. She thought about what it meant to be part of a thing someone else had started. Not to own it, not to take it over, but to be trusted with it, to carry some of the weight of it, to add your own work to the foundation without claiming what came before. She didn't have a clean name for what she was in this family. She was Ethan's wife on paper, and something more than that in practice, and something different from a mother to 4 children who already had one, and something that was its own category. The person who showed up when things were burning and stayed when things were hard and kept the accounts straight and made the bread and argued with suppliers and sat at the kitchen table in the evenings and was simply, consistently, reliably there. She thought that might be enough. She thought it might be more than enough, She thought it might be the thing that mattered most in the end. Not the dramatic moments, not the burning barn and the pulled free gate and the case built in the cold weeks of December, but the daily accumulation of showing up. That was what people remembered, not the heroic gesture, the dailiness. The dinner for Eleanor's birthday was on the 14th of May. Clara made the food Eleanor had apparently loved: a roasted chicken with root vegetables, an apple cake with a thick crust that May said was not quite right, and then corrected herself, quietly, and said it was close. Actually, it was pretty close. Rose set the table with a care that she did not usually bring to table setting, arranging everything precisely, moving a fork twice until it was where she wanted it. Henry talked through most of the meal, as he always did, about his rocks and the spring pasture and a hawk he'd been watching build a nest in the eastern fence line, and the talking was right. It was the right amount of ordinary for an evening that was trying to be both ordinary and significant. Ethan was quiet in the way he was quiet on evenings when he was feeling something he had not found the words for yet. After the meal, Caleb took the dishes to the kitchen with May, and Rose fell asleep against Clara's arm at the table in the manner of a 5-year-old who had decided this was where she was staying for the evening, and Henry eventually wound down and went to bed. And then it was just Clara and Ethan at the table with the lamp and the remains of the apple cake. He poured 2 cups of coffee. He pushed one toward her. They sat in the quiet for a while, which had long since stopped being uncomfortable, and was simply the natural texture of their evenings. "She would have liked you," he said. Clara looked at him. "Eleanor," he said, "she liked people who said what they meant." A pause. "She would have had a lot of opinions about the bakery." Good opinions or critical ones? Both, probably, in the same sentence. Something moved in his face that was the closest thing to ease she had seen there in the months she had known him. She was efficient that way. Clara looked at the lamp. "I'm sorry you lost her," she said. "I know," he said. He was quiet for a moment. "I'm not sorry about what came after." He said it carefully, aware of what the words carried. "I don't know how to say that without it sounding like the wrong thing." "It doesn't sound like the wrong thing," she said. He looked at her. "Clara," he said, for what she had counted now as the small handful of times he had said her name, each one distinct, each one meaning something different, this one meaning something she had been waiting to hear said plainly for a long time. "I know," she said, before he could say more. Not because she didn't want him to say it, but because she knew it, and she wanted him to know that she knew it, and sometimes the most important thing you can offer someone is the evidence that you have already been paying attention. He looked at her for a moment. "All right," he said, and there was something in it, a warmth, quiet and specific, that was not going to announce itself or perform itself, that was simply going to be there now, in the same way the repaired porch railing had simply been there one morning and the woodbox had simply been full. It was enough. It was more than enough. Caleb came back to the kitchen doorway and looked at them both with the assessing eyes that were so completely his father's and said, "Rose is going to need to be carried up." "I'll get her," Clara said, and she went back to the table and gathered Rose, who weighed more than she looked, and carried her up the stairs in the warm lamplight while Rose made the specific deep sounds of a child utterly and completely asleep. She put Rose in her bed and pulled the blanket up. She stood there for a moment in the dark room. She thought about the platform in October, the auctioneer's voice, the crowd's laughter, the specific cold of standing in front of strangers who had already decided about you before you opened your mouth. She thought about Ethan walking up from the back of the crowd. She thought about the suitcase she had arrived with, the $43, the worn dress, the 3 years of saving, and the letter written by candlelight. She had thought on that platform that she was accepting the only chance she had, that she was being practical about her options, that what was happening was the best available outcome from a situation that had very few good outcomes, and that she should be grateful and sensible and not ask for more than she had reason to expect. She had been wrong. Not about being practical. That had been right. Not about being sensible. That had served her. But about the ceiling. About how high the ceiling was. About what was possible in a life when you stopped apologizing for occupying the space you occupied and simply worked, simply stayed, Simply showed up every day and did what needed doing and told the truth and kept records and argued with suppliers and made the bread and sat at the table in the evenings. The ceiling, it turned out, was quite a lot higher than she had been taught to believe. She had been taught, by years and by circumstance, and by men like Marcus Vale and auctioneers like Pemberton and every person who had looked at her and seen someone not worth much. She had been taught to keep her expectations low and her needs small, and her space in the world minimal. To be grateful for what she got and not ask questions about what she might deserve. She had followed that teaching for a long time. She was done following it. Not loudly, not in any dramatic sense. She was not going to make speeches about it. She was just going to keep going, keep working, keep building, keep expecting in a quiet and stubborn way that the work she did was worth the space she took up. That was the thing nobody told you about worth. You didn't receive it from other people's opinions. You didn't earn it by making yourself small enough that nobody could object to you. You built it, slowly, in the daily way, stone by stone, in a life that kept going whether or not it was convenient. She had been building it her whole life without knowing what it was. Now she knew what it was. She went out of Rose's room and down the hall, and she paused outside May's door, which was open, as it usually was now. May was reading by her lamp, a book Clara recognized from the shelf in the front room. She had been working her way through the shelf methodically, with a focus that Clara found genuinely admirable. May looked up. The cake was close, May said. The crust was a little thicker than hers, but the filling was right. I'll adjust next year, Clara said. May looked at her. Next year, she said. A statement, not a question, but with something underneath it that asked a question. Next year, Clara confirmed. May looked back at her book. Okay, she said. Clara went downstairs. In May, the bakery had its first profitable month. Not dramatically profitable, enough to service the loan, cover the costs, and leave something small over that was technically a margin. Clara showed May the numbers on a Saturday morning, and May said the billings rate adjustment made a difference. And Clara said, it did, and your revision to that letter was what made the rate adjustment possible. And May did not look up from the numbers, but she sat a little straighter. In June, the Henderson water dispute was resolved. Caleb's idea, Clara's framing, about seasonal water access had taken the argument off the table entirely, exactly as she had predicted. Henderson had accepted without drama, because he had never wanted the argument. He had wanted the water. Caleb did not make a large thing of being right. He mentioned it once, at the kitchen table, in the manner of someone noting a conclusion. You were right about Henderson, he said. You were right about the water, she said. I just helped with the framing. He shrugged, but he looked, briefly, the way Henry looked when someone thanked him, too pleased to quite hide it. In July, on a clear evening when the sky was doing the thing it did in Montana in midsummer, the long, slow light that seemed to go on past the time light should reasonably last, gold and wide, and almost unbearably open, Clara and Ethan were on the porch. She had her accounts. He had a piece of fence hardware he was repairing with the focus of a man who thinks better when his hands are busy, which she recognized because she was the same. Rose was in the yard, conducting some kind of elaborate game with the cat that still had not learned any tricks and continued to participate reluctantly. Henry was in the barn, explaining something to one of the newer ranch hands, whose expression through the barn door suggested he was receiving more information than he had asked for. May's lamp was on in her window. Caleb's horse was tied at the post, which meant he was somewhere nearby. Clara put down her pen. She looked at the yard and the barn and the horizon beyond it, the mountains going dark against the summer sky, the new barn with its fresh timber that would weather in a few years and look like it had always been there. She thought about what she had told Henry in April in the kitchen, about why people stayed somewhere, not because they had no other options, because it was theirs. This was hers, not in the legal sense only, not just the name on a certificate or the signature on a lease. Hers in the way of something you have put your hands on every day that has your particular mark on it, that exists differently because you were part of it. The accounts she had rebuilt, the contracts she had renegotiated, the children she had not replaced their mother for but had, simply and steadily, been there for. The bakery that smelled of bread 3 mornings a week. The porch railing that didn't wobble anymore. The man beside her who had walked up from the back of a crowd when everyone else had turned away, and who had said, in his plain and unceremonious way, everything that mattered. Ethan set down the fence hardware. He looked at her. She looked at him. Neither of them said anything. They didn't need to. This was not a story about a woman who was saved by a man who chose her. That was not what had happened, though it was a convenient shape for the story. What had actually happened was that 2 people, both of whom were doing the hard and imperfect work of staying alive and moving forward in a world that was not particularly gentle about it, had recognized something in each other. Not a completion, not a rescue, but a recognition. The specific recognition that says, you know what this is like. And from that recognition, they had built something, not elegantly, not without mistakes or silence or the specific friction of 2 people who had both learned to be self-sufficient, learning to make room for someone else. But genuinely, with the accumulated weight of real days behind it. Clara Whitmore had arrived in Harlan Creek with a worn dress and a suitcase and the determination of someone who has run out of alternatives and decided that is fine. She had expected very little. She had expected to work hard and be practical and keep her expectations low and be grateful for what she got. Instead, she had rebuilt a household, raised a barn on paper before anyone raised it in timber, faced down a man who had tried to own her and taken him apart document by document, made bread that people waited in line for, helped a 13-year-old girl find her footing in a world that was going to underestimate her. The same way it had underestimated her, watched a 9-year-old name her as the reason he believed someone could stay, been trusted with the memory of a woman she never met, and found herself on a July evening in Montana, sitting on a porch beside a man who had seen her clearly from the first moment and had never once asked her to be smaller. She had not known, on the platform in October, that any of this was possible. That was the thing worth saying. Not that life rewarded the deserving, chut. It didn't. Not reliably, not fairly, not without considerable cost. Not that goodness was always recognized or effort always compensated. The world was not arranged that way, and anyone who told you it was had not been paying attention. But this, the ceiling is higher than they told you, almost always, in almost every life. The space available to you is larger than the space you were assigned, and the people who assigned it to you were not authorities on the subject. They were just people who had decided about you before they knew you, which is a thing people do, and which is their limitation, not yours. You could not control what they decided. You could control whether you believed them. Clara had stopped believing them somewhere between Duluth and Montana, somewhere in the 3 days on the stage with her $43 and her worn suitcase and her letter written by candlelight. She had not known that was what she was doing. She had just been going somewhere. She had just been refusing, in the specific stubborn way she had, to stay in a place that was killing her slowly. That refusal, that small, unglamorous, daily refusal to accept the assigned space, had brought her here, to this porch, to this evening, to this life that was imperfect and complicated and full of accounts that needed balancing and children who needed consistency and a man who said everything important in 3 words or less, and a town that had laughed at her and then lined up for her bread. Full of work, full of the specific weight of real things. She picked up her pen. She went back to the accounts. Beside her, Ethan picked up the fence hardware. The light held on, the way it did in Montana in July, long past the time you expected it to give up. The yard was warm and ordinary and completely, entirely hers.